Hey everyone, I have a spreadsheet. I've created a spreadsheet of all our meetings, if anyone would find that useful. There it is, if you find it useful.
I'll see if I can understand it.
It's a complete listing of all of our meetings to date with links to the YouTubes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, because I've been backtracking from day one and trying to orient myself here. And that's a long time ago. I see
Yeah,
things 4 years ago. Do you have inclusions from 4 years ago, other meetings,
I've,
or
I've
just
got
these?
I got them all. I don't think I missed one.
Oh, great. Thank
They're
you.
all on there.
Good.
I should make one of the greatest studies in human history. What do you reckon?
I think it will probably take the rest of my life to go through these. I went to the first meeting here. I remember Rick saying in the first 5 minutes, this may take a year. And this is 3 years late, over 3 years later. So,
Hello, everybody.
Oh, Rick.
How are you doing, Stephen?
Oh, well, all the pressures of Christmas coming up. There
Well, we
used to be
like you
one
just
day a
the way you
year.
are. You don't have to get us anything.
There used to be just one day a year, but the commerce has turned it into several weeks. I don't know how Gawain would have coped looking for the Green Knight if Christmas ran for several weeks. He only noticed it was Christmas virtually on the night. Oh, yeah.
I'd like to read
Hey,
that. It's been a few decades.
hey, Rick, I want to tell you that as before, I've been having daily blackouts on my internet. So I might black out. Well, for you guys, I won't be blackout, I don't think. So just a warning. It's not that I disappear on purpose, it's that the divine up there has made me disappear.
Thanks for the heads up. We'll keep an eye on you.
But I might as well show myself while I'm still here. Who knows how long I'll be here?
Well, the question is, we a new wine skin or an old wine skin? Can you absorb the new wine?
It's the interesting thing about these transitions is they start out as critiques with what's wrong with the old order. And the critique is done from the perspective that, okay, there are things about the world that are working and there's things about the world that are not working. So we just have to change the things that are not working, but the rest of it will leave the same. And when we do that, we're falling prey to that problem that mortals have where we oversimplify the problem. We assume that the things that are working, we can mostly leave alone. We'll come back to them later. But usually it's the case that by the time we've changed all the things that aren't working, the things that are working don't work anymore. They need to be changed too. Take into account those changes. But instead, we sort of carry on, and adapt the structure. And so you end up with that weird theological empire instead of a strictly military empire coming out of at the beginning of the medieval period. And the question to be raised, but that they weren't in a position to raise, is I wonder if an empire is the right metaphor here. Does God really want us to conquer the world? Is that what Jesus asked us to do? When he said turn the other cheek, did he mean, stab the guy in the belly with a sword because he won't convert? These questions are, they don't have time to think about them because they're too busy thinking about the horrible things about
Turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
What do you think that means?
Well, it depends, right? I've heard multiple interpretations.
I only remember the old style of dueling was you could slap a guy in the face once, and the other guy could refuse it once.
Yes.
And if you slapped him in the face again and he refused it, that meant he was a coward. So Jesus might have meant give the other person the benefit of the doubt.
Well, do you think that it might mean a spanking? Like spanking one cheek in the ass, and then the other cheek, you just turn it over.
No.
Complete spanking behind the point.
No, I think it means give the other person the benefit of the doubt. But if they keep on doing it, one day you're going to have to defend yourself.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the alternate interpretations. Another alternate interpretation I heard from someone who took his theology pretty seriously and was a Christian. He said that turn the other cheek means turn and leave. That, you don't stay in an abusive situation. And I thought that's interesting because neither of the other two major interpretations says that. One of them says you can take it one more time and then that's it. And one of them says, take it as long as you need to. I hadn't ever heard anyone say get out. Is the
reason I use my examples, it's historically established. So whether that custom went back to the time of Jesus, I don't know, but it was there in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Because if you read about the Vikings, for example, you didn't have the option to be a coward.
Right.
When Christianity came along, hey guys, we're all free to be cowards. Yay! I can slink away, I can chicken out, and I still go to heaven. But in that society, in the Viking society, and probably I assume any other sort of aggressive barbarian society, you showed yourself to be a coward, everyone's going to walk all over you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we alluded to this a month or two ago as a general topic, not the specific topic. And the general topic is the problem of one of the ways that new wine is in old wineskins is a taste for aphorisms. There's a lot of aphorisms in the Bible and in the oral culture that surrounds the Bible and in the written culture, the Apocrypha and the other materials. But our problem is aphorisms are easy to fake on the surface, but very hard to get right. Because proper or improper, an aphorism has to be concise. It has to be short and punchy and evocative and stick in people's minds. And many people, although not everybody, can manage that level of an aphorism. But to be a real aphorism, it also has to be chewy in a way that leads you to the intended message. It can't be chewy in a way that gets you to 4 different contradictory messages and you can't tell which one is meant. It's very easy to write the self-contradictory, ambiguous aphorisms. And the Bible's full of them. There's all kinds of aphorisms in there that can be read to mean peace or war. They can be generous or be greedy. It's like, what did the speaker mean? We have no way of finding out because of the structure of the aphorism. It's not, we use the example of not being able to step in the same river twice. It seems to have contradictions. It's got interesting paradoxes, but when you scratch the surface, you can't avoid the message that he's saying. The major part is change. Underneath that, there is a subtle continuity of the laws of nature, but the laws of nature generate all this change. But clearly, he's basically creating a dialectic between dynamism and stasis. And Very few people walk away from that step in the same river twice thing and think, oh, he says nothing changes. It's very hard to read that out of the aphorism. The paradox has a structure. It's like the finger pointing at the moon. It does in fact point. And if you follow the finger, you can find the moon. But a lot of these others turn the other cheek. It's not clear where it's pointing. You sense that it's pointing somewhere, but when you try to resolve it, you can come up with 3 or 4 equally plausible interpretations, each of which has historical precedent and has cultures behind it and so forth. And that level, the ambiguous aphorism, it's interesting because on the one hand, it's less nutritious. You're not guaranteed that you're going to get a sophrosune out of it, right? If we're talking about sophrosune as the missing ingredient for Homo sapiens. But on the other hand, it's more likely to be popular because if you don't like the intended interpretation, but there's 3 others to pick from, one of the others might please you. And so you can have a situation where everybody's quoting the same aphorism, but they're meaning opposite things by it. So, that's the challenge that we have with this kind of literature, where it's not specific and dialectical enough to be a finger pointing to the moon. It's evocative, it's memorable, but it can be used at cross purposes. I think about the rallying cry that came out of the Holocaust after World War II, never again, which lots of people quote never again. I quote it all the time. Lots of people do. But the problem is it's not clear what it means. Does it mean no one should ever suffer from genocide again? Or does it mean we should never suffer from genocide again, but fuck all the rest of you? And it can be read either way. And in the world today, it is being used both ways by, very powerful forces on both sides are using the exact same quote as a justification for opposite behavior. So we need a word somehow we need some terminology to distinguish a true aphorism, like you can't step in the same river twice, from a pseudo, I guess we could call it a pseudo aphorism, like never again, where it's just too ambiguous. And the ambiguity isn't some little detail. It's like, what is the whole central point of this? And the answer is, I don't know.
Well, Rick, I myself don't think we could ever get anything really clear. I mean, that's part of our perception and part of our language and technology. I mean, everything, there's a degree of ambiguity within it. So therefore, in a sense, it is by nature unclear. I experienced this when I was teaching at university, not University of Kansas State University, when a perceptual psychologist came in, and he had a very simple experiment. He just he gave a bunch of glasses at which is prismatic. In other words, when you're looking straight, the thing shifts to the left, I guess to some people to the right.
Mm-hmm.
So, you always think what you're looking at is straight ahead at you, but that's to the right. It's like, but that's by the nature of a perception. It's like, I guess you get used to it, but nonetheless, it's that I asked him the question, like, God, this is confusing. Like, I mean, where is the thing?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, that's beyond my pay grade. You have to talk to a philosopher. I'm a perceptual psychologist, right?
Yeah.
Because I have no idea where it really is, Our perception just say our eyes are made that it's like 30 degrees at one side, and that's where you think it is.
Yes.
But who the hell knows? So it starts with perception, and words makes it even worse because words get even more confused. So I think when you're looking for the absolute truth, you could just forget about it. There's only relative truth and you got to be able to think in a degree of fog. I mean,
yes,
that's all there is to it.
Yes, that's right, Phil. And the thing about it is that there's a spectrum between totally ambiguous and absolute truth. So one doesn't have to settle for one end or the other end. One can say, is this more or less ambiguous? Is it more or less clear? Aristotle spends a lot of time in his writing trying, and for modern audiences mostly failing, to get us to focus on the difference between details and essential features. and say, you're not going to get everything right. So try to get the essential features right. When you look at the cheetah, what are the essential features of the cheetah? Not all of the bit. You're never going to see all the bits because we're mortals. But can you find the center of it? And so that's kind of what we want to be striving for with true aphorisms, is we want to strive for where it may be hard to understand. It may require a lot of work from the reader, but if they do the work, most of them will arrive at the essence of the thing, even if the details are off. And one of the ways that I've heard this said is, an aphorism that pleases everybody isn't an aphorism at all. It's just a pseudo-aphorism. But an aphorism that pleases some people and infuriates others might be a real aphorism, because there's a real essence that it guides you towards, and that essence is going to provoke a reaction. Some people are going to agree with it. Some are going to disagree with it. But the people who disagree with the intent aren't going to be able to read it and walk away saying, this says what I like to hear. They're going to walk away going, I hate you. This is a stupid aphorism. They don't like, the core argument. The core argument is visible enough to antagonize people. So another way I've heard that said is, if you only have friends and no enemies, you don't stand for anything. Not that you should be searching out enemies, but if you stand for something and it's clear that you stand for it, it's going to piss somebody off. Somebody's got a vested interest that runs counter to whatever you're standing for. The ones everybody likes the most are the ones who seem to be everything to all people. And of course, the problem then is they don't actually stand for anything. They just smile and shake any hand. Stephen, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I saw Heretic on the weekend, the movie. Oh, I'm glad you're looking forward to it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. Tell me.
Well, what's interesting, actually, the first half was pretty good. Very, very good piece of work. But story-wise, the latter half descends into a sort of little bit of a B-grade story. It's like they couldn't come up with a good proposition for the second half of the story. So it's pretty ordinary horror, I mean. But the theme is one you've presented, and I think it comes from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche argued, didn't he, that the things concerned with the conscious mind, like rationality, are, in a certain sense, against life. In other words, if you were to become excessively rational, you would cut yourself off from your life motive. The interesting thing is, of course, the bad guy in the story, the heretic, is a rationalist. He's an atheist rationalist, the very heights of what we worship in culture, but he's gone down, his rationality has taken him on the path to hell. He's trying to find an essence, like his question is, what is common to all religions? I have to find that essence. I have to know that one single answer. And like, the Nazi doctors of the horror stories of World War II, he'll do anything to find that knowledge. But his rationality has taken him to hell. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a taste for horror films. After my upbringing, not the gratuitous horror that's just a roller coaster, but horror that really gets under your skin because it explores something that really matters. I like that stuff. So I can tell I'm going to enjoy Heretic. Thank you for pointing me at it. Horror is one of those genres where you have to have a lot of endurance in order to find the gems. There's a lot of mediocre and bad horror, but hidden in it is some magnificent horror. And more frequently, the good horror consists of flawed films that have something interesting in them. And you have to say, well, this part of the film is, but this part is really interesting. Because the thing about horror is it encourages digging into the things that make us uncomfortable. And as a result, even somebody who maybe doesn't have the budget for the special effects or couldn't hire a good actor, the story might still be really interesting. It might be touching on something that that matters, that's important, that a bigger film might have been afraid to deal with. I know one horror film, and I won't say which one because I don't want any spoilers, in which the object of fear, which takes a long time, it takes the whole film for them to figure out why bad things are happening. But in the end, they figure out it's the English language is the problem. And it's acting like a virus and causing people to be violent and attack each other. And the only way out of the dilemma is to speak French. French doesn't have this problem, the English does. And every time people hear the English language, it makes them more suspicious and violent. And this isn't like, this is the kind of thing you're never going to see Steven Spielberg make a movie about. It's way too interesting getting at the problem of language. I know another one based on a Cthulhu story, but they ran with it in their own direction. And in that film, the protagonist is a computer guy who has taken binary too much to heart. And now he's made a whole philosophy of life out of binary. Things either are what they are. They're either true or false. They're either good or bad. It's everything that he tries to purify his thinking into these intellectual categories. And it kind of reminds me a little of what you're talking about, Stephen. It's like, what is the consequence of that kind of thinking? And let's just say in this Lovecraft film, it ends badly for the protagonist. The life is too nuanced for that sort of nonsense. So I'll have to go look at Heretic.
Well, that's a question, isn't it? There are many intellectuals who would say, oh, there must be a single essence behind everything. And once we go down far enough, we'll find that single essence. But what if the supposed essence is not just one, it's a series of essences?
Right.
Let's say you've got a dice with 1 to 6 on it, and anything can come up. Well, that's not going to please some people, especially Einstein.
Yes. Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, what Stephen just mentioned just reminded me of a thought I came out with when I was at a different meeting. I guess I'll roughly call it the surface structure, and the relationship. I'll use a metaphor here in a sense between the terrestrial and the celestial. I mean, the problem is that consciousness, and we all deal with consciousness in some form, is something that you could begin to formulate concepts and things and rationality, thought, and all that kind of stuff. But that's to a certain degree related to the subconscious, or even to something like history. For instance, you go back and you find in archaeology or anthropology, you find a vase that's never been seen before, and you're wondering, like, to what degree, when you look at that vase, are you able to see what actually produced it? Does history actually move forward and you actually can't see it? So therefore history actually just moved backwards and you're interpreting it. You're giving meaning to the thing itself. So therefore rationality has a way of interpreting the unknown. It really reminds me of Heidegger, like the what becomes eventually surface either through it pushing up its unknown to say, oh, that, the what becomes that. Or is it that the conscious substance in our mind pushes downward and retrieves that from the what? And we actually do not know what the what is, but we give it a meaning. And so therefore history flows backwards. Now, I think the problem is when you think that actually the thing in the depth actually surfaces and pushes forward, then you get into the fact that there's some deep understanding. I mean, there's depth to that. And then you get into somebody like Carl Jung, not that I don't believe in Carl Jung, but you invent a story, the hero's journey to his destiny, you know, and return to civilization, all that. It's like, well, okay, that's a nice story, but that is a story that in some sense, you know, he made up, you know, by certain clues. Was it really that way? You know, and I did ask the question, you know, like uh, that story had to come from the fact that you could tell stories. That the archaeologists found recently uh, this these I guess these arrowheads, you know, or spearheads are made out of flint, you know, made out of whatever rocks that they were able to make, and they believed that it was 3.5 million years old, which means that it existed before there was any humanoids, homos, you know. It was Australopithecus in some point. It's on his way to being there. So then in a sense, they didn't have any kind of really formal language, but somebody was able to make these things just by feeling, oh, maybe it'll work this way, maybe it'll work that way, but without actually conceptualizing it or certainly transferring, except maybe showing it to somebody else, you know. So therefore, this analytical thinking, you know, or you know what I call instrumental thinking, didn't really develop until we at least had something like related to language that we could actually talk and express itself. So that's a mystery that there's some kind of thinking. Let's put it that way. Some kind of thinking. Let's say deep feelings, you know, and animals have that to a certain degree, right? And so in some sense, they didn't tell stories. They just have these feelings about what to do, what's right, what's not right to do. And so therefore, in a sense, is that the depth? I mean, the relationship between the feelings and thinking? Because I often wonder, like, I remember when I got the job at Youngstown State, you know, the dean, you know, my final meeting was with the dean because he wanted to make sure everything's okay. And he asked a very curious question. He said, Philip, tell me what's the difference between painting and music, between art and music, you know? And he thought he was going to stump me, but, you know, I took the thing. I said, you know, the thing is, music is lucky because we don't, you know, since 90% or maybe even more, maybe even 95% of our contact with the world is through vision, is a very, very dominant thing. And so therefore we have to develop something that's objectifying, in other words, turning the what into that in order to function in the world. So in some sense, that objectification makes it hard for us to have to deconstruct reality to get into a way that will open up possibilities. Rather than music, you exist in a floating world. It is meant to be something that's more ambiguous, that you deal with harmony and all that, rather than objectification. So therefore, in a sense, is that the meaning of the depth to the surface? Because with art, it's already surface. In order to get to the depth, you actually have to like become like a submarine, a dive down to the depth and break up things. And that's what cubism coming, break up things in order to let things gel and mix together in a new formation that, you know, that wouldn't have been there if you just like, you know, you paint one vase, you paint another vase, you paint another vase. I mean, okay, I got enough of that stuff. So I think that there's something going on in the human mind that is somehow interacting. And that's why I meant when I got very upset about listening to Bruckner, you know, you could feel the depth it's coming, and never surfaces. Damn it, like to what degree is the mind able to go into the depths? I mean, do we go 10 feet, 200 feet, 20,000 leagues? I mean, so therefore, in a sense, like even in terms of operating every day, something that happened 10 years ago, oh yeah, we could trace it back, no problem, right? 100 years, oh, we begin to get lost. And when you find a vase that's like 5,000 years old, you have to make it up. you you have no connection with the rest of the culture. You have lost a ecological relationship that produced that. Okay, so we put our ecology into that understanding of a specific what into that thing, and we say, oh, that's what it is.
Right.
So I kind of think that we have this ability to project into the past in order to harmonize the thing that is mystifying, that should have remained the what rather than the that. And so I think that we have a mind that desperately wants to find out what that is. Okay. And so I think that relationship in the surface structure, which is like the realm of dreams and whatever, and to the conscious thought, it's a very, very rich area in terms of how far could the depth go
Yes.
until it's lost. I mean, like even with Bruckner, when the thing comes, you can to sense it. It doesn't remain at the bottom the whole time. It's like it would be senselessly even listening to Bruckner. So I'll just leave it at that. I think that relationship is very important. If people don't have that sense of deeping down to the terrestrial and then
Yes.
riding the terrestrial, then in a sense, and only live on the surface, that's all it is, then
Mhm.
you're not in expanding your consciousness either to the
That's right.
horizon or to
That's
the depth of the soul. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that issue of the shallow and the deep and the ability to project backwards and how much of it is genuinely finding your way to some kind of truth and how much of it is projection and Procrustean beds. This is like going to be one of the major themes of the medieval epoch. There is this constant struggle to get back from contemporary practice to what did Jesus want us to do, that causes an interesting kind of the kind of wrestling match you're talking about that happens in the theology for 1,000 years during the medieval epoch, and it's going to come up a lot. I'm going to call on Donna in a second. I just want to add, over the weekend I really started into my medieval reading, and in preparation for the next 2 years, and it's clear that in the same way that we went through some terminology in the ancient world to try to get some of the core ideas across, we're going to need to do that for the medieval world as well. So I'm going to be supplementing over the next 7 to 10 chapters that are the medieval epoch that Kenneth's written for us. I'm going to be supplementing with some additional key terms from medieval theology that he doesn't talk about a lot in here, but it sort of underlies his summaries and conclusions. So I think that'll help. I'm reading about the kerygma and the zugba and all the interesting little aspects and questions and points that they struggled over in the theology. It's and what the implications were, and how did that fit into the overall scheme. It's going to be interesting stuff. Donna, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm going back in history, but every so often you mention the Apocrypha. And it has always been strange. And of course, I was raised Episcopalian, so they threw out Ecclesiastes. However, I do not understand. I mean, if there's any book I will read again and again, it's Ecclesiastes. And I understand historically when it was thrown out, but I would like a little bit more of your interpretation of why that was thrown out. The other thing I want to mention is I'm going through all of these from day one, from the first version of this. And in the first 5 minutes of the first episode of this, you said this may last a year. Maybe it will last a year. And this is going to go on another, I don't know, what, 5 years, 10 years from what it is right now. But anyway, I laughed when I heard that.
Yes.
But again, about Ecclesia, and I've got to show you. I don't know if you know the artist Barry Mosher, and I don't know if you can see this, but I have his version of the old Bible. He was an artist I knew back in the Berkshires. He's dead now, but he had this is his own engravings in his own Bible. But that's Ecclesiastes, that's the preacher.
Yes.
And that's part of why I love this Bible, because Barry Mosher illustrated it. But in any case, that's an important book to me. And I've always wondered why it spoke so much to me. However, it's been thrown out, you know. It's still in some of the Catholic Bibles, but you know, really.
You knew Barry Moser.
Oh, yeah.
It's a
I mean,
small world.
he was only down the road from me. Yeah, his press. I mean, he was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I have 3 of his prints on my wall in my laundry room.
Oh, okay.
I love his work.
Have you seen his Bible?
No, I have only heard of it. That what you just showed me just percolated the imagination.
Oh, yeah. He did, let's see, the King James Version. But
Yeah.
in any case, you know, I'm glad that he included Ecclesiastes in there.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts about that? Why did they throw it out? It's such a common sense book.
Yeah. Well, each of the major books that got excluded, we're going to spend some time with over the next 2 years. We're really going to do this. We're going to get into this because the problem for moderns, as much as the ancient worldview is difficult because it's so alien from our worldview, the problem with the medieval worldview for us is that modernity pushed off against it. And so for us, the medieval world, it's very hard to get past our caricature of it that we need in order to justify the modern world. It has to be the Dark Age. It has to be all the bad things that we supposedly don't do anymore. We've dumped those all into the medieval epoch and we really bend it out of shape. And it means that, and also it's important to us. That warping, that bending is really important to us because if we tamper with the bending, equal and opposite reaction, it then tampers with our self-image as moderns. It starts to question some things about who we are, and that's dangerous. That's where people get ideologically, they dig their heels in and they fight back. They do not want to confront those kinds of issues. And I think Kenneth does this a little bit in here. He's obviously worked hard to try to undo that reflex, to make them just a caricature so that he can justify modernity. The fact that he's an anti-modern critic helps a little bit to peel back and look at the medieval world. But he still does it some. And so part of what I'm going to try to do over the next 2 years is correct that a little and bend us back like he was intending even further into seeing the medievals as they actually are. And that means we need to arm ourselves with specific cases like Ecclesiastes. We really have to understand why was this excluded? When you look at what's in it, why was it excluded? I put a link to early Christian writings. Ecclesiastes isn't there. But what's interesting, I've spent so much time on that website. It's just a fascinating resource. It basically summarizes all the research we have about all the early Christian writings. And it points you at all the different people who've had theories about why this book, why that book, and so forth. It doesn't address Old Testament Apocrypha. And so Ecclesiastes is left out. There are other resources for that. But one of the things that you see in the early Christian writings website is how many excluded books. There were sort of 3 major criteria for what was included in the canon and what was excluded. For what was, 4 major criteria. For what was included, the first criterion is it central to the dogma that we want to push in the medieval epoch? We're picking something as correct, as orthodox. And if a work really clearly reinforces that correct orthodoxy, it goes into the canon. That was like rule number 1. Rule number 2 is they're trying to,
Yeah.
Although the official history says the opposite of this, the truth of early Christianity is it didn't start out with one truth that then split into multiple truths. That is not the way it worked. There's no evidence at all that it worked that way. The evidence suggests that there were many varieties of Christianity, and the Orthodox movement had to prune slash seduce slash convince slash reconcile these into something unified enough and strong enough that it could then appeal to an emperor and become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. That was like clearly on the to-do list for the kind of what we might call the proto-Orthodox subset of Christianity. They wanted to weave together. And so they had to exclude things that weren't going to fit. That was the third criteria. What is absolutely, so antithetical to our dogma, we have to push it out. That explains some of what went out. But the second criteria was what else went in is if there was a large population of Christians that had a different perspective from the proto-Orthodoxy, but they're too big to dismiss. You can't kill them. You can't ignore them. And that means you really have to co-opt them and get them into your movement. Then they would include a book that they didn't want to otherwise include. Revelation, the Apocalypse of John is a classic example of that. The early canonizers write about the fact that they don't buy Revelations. They're really deeply disturbed by a lot of the stuff that Revelation says. They think this thing is, they're not sure it's legitimate. They think it's a fake. And they think it might lead to bad behavior. But there are just too many early Christians that like it. If they exclude it, they're going to lose all those people. So they say it straight out. So reluctantly, they included it, but they made it the last book, and they hoped you wouldn't get that far. They're like, maybe you'll get tired of reading and it won't influence you. Boy, that bet backfired. So
I don't know how Ecclesiastes could lead to bad behavior, but whatever.
Well, so where are we? So we said the things that are central to the orthodoxy go in.
I understand. Yeah.
Anything that's a beloved book by too large a faction of Christians, that has to go in. Otherwise, it splits the early Christians, and they're trying to put them together. Anything that directly contradicts the central orthodoxy that they can't find a way to reconcile, that goes out. And then the fourth thing is things that are too implausible, things that have a bad, what provenance? I see Phil dropped off. I'm sure he'll be back in a moment. But the provenance. If it says it's written by Mark, is it plausible? It doesn't have to be true that it was written by Mark. They talk about this, but is it plausible? Could it have been written by Mark? Could this be something Paul would have said? Could this be something? And if the answer is no way in hell, it is just so out of character for that person to have said or written that thing, those ones went out. And so there are a bunch of gospels. You'll see it on the early Christian writing site. There are a bunch of gospels that are not in the Bible, and like the Gospel of James, the Gospel of Peter. And some of these gospels, like they were written too late. Like they would have come out of the 2nd century and not the 1st century. And everybody knew they didn't show up until the 2nd century. And they're like, okay, that's out. That can't be included. Other books that were excluded include just crazy things. I can't remember if it's the Gospel of James or Peter, in which when the time comes for the stone to be rolled back from the tomb to see that Jesus is still alive, when it's rolled back, a gigantic 700-foot tall cross emerges from the tomb, reaching up to the clouds, and begins narrating, this is Jesus and he has risen again and so forth. And, the canonizers are like, no, that's nobody's, unless you're on serious drugs, nobody's going to believe that a 700-foot tall cross came out of this tomb. First of all, it wouldn't fit. And second of all, wow, man, what have you been smoking? So, they're like, I don't care what else is in that gospel. That gospel's out, right? It's even if it's an important gospel. So these are the 4 criteria. So what it means is you can find the test anywhere on here. You could say, what if it's not essential to promulgating their dogma? If it's like, it might be full of wisdom literature, but if it's not essential, they could justify leaving it out. What if it's something that it could be really wise, but only a small number of people love it? Then they're like, well, we don't have to add it back in because we won't lose a giant faction of the early Christians. So they might leave it out. What if, and this is possibly one of the things with Ecclesiastes, what if it was beloved by a community that they decided to kick out and that they didn't like, they didn't want to support them, they did everything they could to undercut them? Even if it was a good book, if they can see the fingerprints of that faction, Like the Gnostic stuff really got thrown out. For 200 years, they kept purging Gnostics from the central church. Then it would have gone out. And of course, the fourth one, and I don't think this applies to Ecclesiastes. If it's implausible, if it contains crazy stuff, if it was written recently, none of that applies to Ecclesiastes. So it can't be that. So it's got to be the other three.
Yeah. But
But-
this was the Protestants really that threw it out, really, wasn't it? It was the Reformation. It wasn't earlier on. It's like, I don't get it. I understand your points. I absolutely do. But
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So Martin Luther and John Calvin, who were involved in the pruning, to create the
Yeah.
Protestant Bible, they actually also documented what their criteria were. So we could actually look up what was their beef with Ecclesiastes. But
in any
the
case, I wanted your take on it because it's always been a quirk, an interesting thing for me. So
we'll come back to it when we get to the modern epoch as well in more detail, but it's worth talking about now. One of the big shifts from medieval Christianity to Protestantism is the idea that you would be saved by faith alone, not by good works. So,
okay.
If a book focuses on how to be a good person, and here's the things that you should do, and here's some wisdom literature that'll teach you to be a mensch, then that's the kind of thing that Martin Luther and John Calvin would be like, yeah, I want to read this stuff about how you're sinners in the hands of an angry God, and only by his grace and your faith are you saved. That's the stuff that they wanted to emphasize.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing it up,
you.
Donna.
Sure.
Sharon, you have something you want to say about that? Yeah, come off mute here.
I have a question which is very relevant to what Donna just said, because I have been under the impression that the original pruning of the contents of the Bible was done by the Council of Nicaea, King Constantine, and it was done for political reasons. Am I correct about that? That's where it all started.
Well, the Council of Nicaea,
Constantine and the Council of Nicaea.
It helped to pin down the selection, but there had already been like 100 years of debates and discussions. So there was a sorting process that had been going on for a while, where they were sort of.
So this was part of the continuity then.
Yes, it's a critical turning point when they try to put an imprimatur, a stamp on a selection, but they were building off of the previous 100 years or so of work in sort of selecting and de-emphasizing.
Okay, thanks.
I'm gonna put a link there. First Council of Nicaea. There we go, 325.
Thank you, Stephen.
First Council of Nicaea. There we go. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, well, something that's occupied my mind is the transition of the axial age. If you look at a legend from Middle Kingdom Egypt, Sinaway the Egyptian, there's clearly an appreciation of what is good and bad in life. It's also very clear what's good in life, and very clear what's bad in life. What's bad in life is to be exiled to Syria. What's good in life is when the Pharaoh says, hey, Sinaway, all is forgiven, come back. I'll appoint you Grand Vizier again. I'll give you a fantastic house on the Nile. He has wives again, children again. And in the distance, he can watch his tomb being built, so he knows he's set for the afterlife as well. There's no doubt about what is good and what is bad. But you come to the age of the classical Greeks, skepticism arises, and not skepticism which just disbelieves in UFOs, a skepticism that wonders, is it all worth it? What's the point? Is it all meaningless? Is it all just vanity? And this is what Ecclesiastes presents. Now, the church would be quite happy to say, for you to say, the worldly things are vanity, The Roman Empire is vanity, but of course that could spread to thinking the church is vanity. Then they're on a real downer. Obviously, you've been out in the streets, you've looked at the world and seen its vanity. Now you must come in the door of the church and see something that is worthwhile, that you have no doubt about. Remember, we're dealing with the age of the Spirit, where people had to have a super powerful God, or they had doubts, you know, will I really be saved by some God that is not all powerful, doesn't control the whole universe? Could I be saved by a God that is subject to chaos? No, there's no chaos. Our God absolutely commands everything, both good and evil. You only have to be set with our God and please him, and you're in like Flynn, you're fine. But what if you start becoming skeptical of that as well? So yes, there'd be some people who'd be worried about a book that presents a skeptical attitude. Thank you. Well, actually, I would add another one. Famously, the book you keep on talking about is the Iliad, and the Iliad is full of characters like Achilles. He's got no doubts about what is good in life. What's good in life is squashing the guy that bothers you. No doubts. But later on, the rational thought presents doubts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So let's look at the text. Let's go to Kenneth's text. I see Sharon leading in, and I'm like, oop, text time. So initially I listed paragraph 6, but we got through paragraph 6 last week, so we're doing paragraph 7 now. And we started into it last week, but it'll be interesting to see how much progress we can make. This is one of the first places where in the medieval section, Kenneth starts drawing distinctions between subsets of the medieval epoch. Up until now, he's mostly been talking about what do they have in common that sets them apart from the ancient world. But now he discusses one of the early splits between theism and deism. And this is important. This is going to be a recurring theme throughout all of these different heresies and blasphemies that we study, as well as the different developments of the orthodoxy over time. So he starts with Christianity was from its founding an uneasy blend of theism and deism, impossible to render rationally coherent. And now he's going to talk about theism for a while, and then in paragraph 8, he's going to talk about deism, so we can see the contrast between the two. The belief in a personal divinity, or theism, derives from the Greek word for God, theos. And we've met this word a great deal in the first section. In chapter 4, we talked about enthusiasm as being entheos, the state of being possessed by a god. We talked about the ancient model of human character as being prone to and dependent upon states of possession by daimones. And so we talked about how the modern word enthusiasm derives from entheos, the Greek phrase, which is referring to the Greeks, the theoi. The Latin deus was incorporated into deism, an utterly different mode of religion. So even though in theory theos and deus mean the same thing, one's just the Greek word and one's the Latin word, in practice, theism and deism are completely different approaches to religion. We're just, you know how English is, right? We just harvest Latin and Greek to do our bidding, and we brutalize the original meanings to form our little scientific and formal technical terminology. So one of the simplest precepts engraved on Apollo's Delphic temple was "Ei, thou art." And before I go on, it's worth saying, people, there are four engravings on the stone in the forecourt to the temple of Apollo at Delphi. that are reasonably well known. Gnothi is the most famous one. Meden Agan means nothing to excess, and that one is reasonably well known, although most people misunderstand what it means. The third one is even less well known than that one. There are a number of ways that it's translated, but one of them is a surety then ruin, or a guarantee then ruin, and it has to do with not giving your word lightly. Don't make promises you can't keep. In other words, but it might have deeper meaning than that, but at least it means that much. And that one gets talked about a certain amount. I don't remember the Greek phrase off the top of my head. I'll have to look it up. But the fourth one is the mysterious one, and it's just the eta, the letter that looks like, I think it's the eta, the letter that looks like an H. It's just one letter, but it stands alone as the fourth precept by itself. And for thousands of years, people have been like, what the heck is that? What is that? Why would there be just a single letter? And the Oracle at Delphi says this is one of the most important precepts there could possibly be. How is that possible? Kenneth here is exploring one of the more interesting theories about that, which is that it's because it's pronounced a, it's a pun, right? Because the Greeks did love their wordplay. That it's a pun. If you say it out loud, you can hear the word ae. You can hear both vowels in it, or the diphthong, shall we say? And then that means it's the conjugation of the verb to be, meaning thou art. So that's the theory that he's working with here. If you do a Google search for the meaning of the Greek letter E on the Oracle of Delphi, you'll find online an entire article written in antiquity by someone speculating about what the heck does that thing mean. If it's so important, why is it so cryptic to be just one letter? So that's what that's why I'm pausing, is just to tell you there's a whole thing about that you can investigate on your own. So his explanation is that A is a memorandum that the gods were never to be thought of as distant or alien, but rather in the intimate second person, which is the conjugation thou art. And in this sense, it's a reference to entheos, the idea that the gods possess us and they're right here with us in our minds, whenever they want to speak. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, I've talked about how and in other places, but especially in the archaic writings, where you can see the depiction. Sometimes the depiction of the gods is they strides across the battlefield, swiping this way and that. But sometimes it'll say, Athena whispered in Odysseus's ear the idea of building the great horse. And what Homer's alluding to, or the Homeric poets are alluding to, is this idea that they had that whenever you have an aha experience, it's not you doing it. It's not your mind doing it. I mean, your soul, your mind is the breath that animates you, the psyche. And when you inhale, other breaths can animate you too. You can inhale other daimons. You can inhale, the essence of a deity. You could inhale Athena, and Athena puts the idea in your head, hey, why don't you make a big hollow horse and offer it as a gift to the Trojans, and you can hide inside it? So that Odysseus thinks he didn't think of the idea. Athena thought of the idea, and she mentioned it. She spoke in his head. So when he talks here about the intimate second person, he's talking really intimate. I mean, right inside you, right inside your mind. Now, for moderns, that's a hard idea, because we tell ourselves that our mind is the part of us that's the most free. We tell ourselves that the mind is the part of us that's the most personal. It's the most us, most separate from other people. There's the famous saying about the Holocaust. They can imprison your body, but you'll always have this little real estate inside your skull where you're free, and nobody can take that away from you. But the ancient idea is quite the opposite. That's where you're least free. The whole structure of the mind is based on imbibing these ideologies and daimons and impressions from the gods, is that we're in a perpetual state of some form of enthusiasm, or frequently dozens of enthusiasms at the same time. Maybe hundreds are possessing us. The structure of our mind itself is full of this possession. And so A might be a reminder that the gods are not physically sitting on a mountain somewhere far away from you, but you're breathing them in and out, and they're influencing you at all times. You have to understand that you're in a relentless state of shifting spiritual possession and influence, and that's the meaning of A. He says, like the riches of the myths, Homeric epic illustrates many times Aristotle's notion of parousia, or being alongside. Boy, this is that term is gonna come up all the time throughout the medieval epoch. This is like sophrosune was to the ancients, parousia is gonna be this huge deal about the nature of the Holy Spirit and the Father and the Son. We're gonna spend a lot of time with that. The sense that the gods inhabit our very skins with us and co-author our acts and motives. And this is where we get a split between the ancient and the medieval world. In the ancient world, they believed what he's saying right here, right? It was Athena or Hera or Ares or Aphrodite or one of them that made me do this thing. The devil made me do it is just an update, a Christian update of the older idea, which is I'm an enthusiast. I'm a creature of enthusiasms, and I'm constantly being influenced by all these polytheistic forces. Only part of this is me, or me is some kind of composite hybrid, and so it is as intimate and mixed as it can be. But by the time we get into the medieval theology, and it really gets developed through Augustine and Aquinas, it's going to shift, and they're going to say the devil can't make you do it. Because God is trying to offer you salvation. And so you always have to be free to choose to do the right thing. You have to be free to choose, good acts and faith in God so that you can go to heaven, because otherwise God would be too cruel, and God's not cruel. He wouldn't put you in a situation you can't make the right choice in. So the medieval concept of the structure of the human mind has done an inversion. The ancients said, yeah, you see these people who can't hold their liquor, they've been possessed by Dionysus. Right? It's not their fault. They're in a state of entheos. It's a weakness in them. It's part of their character. But you can't say they chose it. But by the time we get to the medieval epoch, everything about heaven and hell becomes about choice. And the concept of free will gets turned up to 11. The ancients believed your will is this complex melange of influences. The medievals, for theological reasons, need to believe that that's no longer true, and maybe never was. That you always have a choice. God is not co-authoring your acts and motives. God is sharing the gift of grace, his divine grace with you, so that you always have a like the clue, the string that Ariadne gives to Theseus. You can always find your way back out of the labyrinth through the grace of God. You're never so trapped you can't find your way out. So instead of co-authoring your acts and motives, God is offering you a way out, but you still have to be the one who chooses the acts and motives. But anyway, this is theism. Theism is the idea that they are in you. That's the ancient idea. And you'll see why the split with deism comes up in a moment. I'll go on in a moment, but let's pause here, and Donna, tell us what's on your mind.
I just had a quick question for clarification. My understanding then, the personal essence of a god is our daemon speaking to us, as in the modern sense that Jung was using it. It's like of an understanding of the modern personality. I mean, I'm trying to go back and forth between Greek and my world, and you understand the language better, but is that it, the personal essence of the overall God in society was our daemon speaking to us personally? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's part of it, and it's an important part of it. So let's start with that, and then add the other part that isn't in what you said. So starting with what you said, you can see it in Heraclitus, ethos anthropoi daimon. A person's character, their ethos, is their daimon. It's like a god over them. It has that much authority over the things we do, and that's exactly in line with what you're saying. That you can, one way to think about the human mind and human character is that it rules over us like a god, in the same way that Poseidon rules over the ocean. It's that authoritative, which means you can't afford to ignore your own character. That would be like ignoring Poseidon. If you ignore Poseidon, you're going to drop to the bottom of the ocean, right? That's what's going to happen to you. If you ignore your own character, you're going to be, hit left and right by the consequences of your character that, frankly, if you're self-blind, everybody around you but you can see. Like, if I've got the alcoholic gene, that means I can't drink alcohol. And if I'm smart, if I'm self-aware, then I say, Beverly, you drink all you want because you don't have the gene, but I can't drink because I do have the gene. And by avoiding that, I avoid catastrophe. But if I'm self-blind, then I might just drink. And now I can't figure out why I lose my job and why my relationships fall apart and why do I keep making all these mistakes? Because I've decided not to know that about myself. And the consequences are very much like if you don't respect Poseidon, but you want to be a sea voyager. Well, guess what? Not a good fate awaits you. So far, that all matches up with what you're saying. In the last month or two, I guess the last 2 months of chapter 4, before we turn to chapter 5, we explored one last critical set of ideas about this. And I think maybe you missed this. So let's take 15 minutes here and summarize it, because it'll be a good refresher for everybody else. It's a critical point. This is this idea that when you look at how F.M. Cornford in Thucydides Mythhistoricus and in From Religion to Philosophy, the way he characterizes Thucydides's model of human behavior and psychology in the history of the Peloponnesian War, and you see how he builds that off of Aeschylus's model of human psychology and his tragedies, like Agamemnon and so forth. This is what Cornford's exploring in these 2 books. He says what you see is that the Greeks, he says his core argument in Thucydides Mythhistoricus is this: Thucydides set out to write an atheistic history, a miracleless history. He set out to write a history that just literally says, what did people do and what did they say? And how can I prove whether they said or did those things? So he's trying to strip out all the supernatural elements of history, which is a huge break with Greek historians of the past. And he says that's his goal right off the bat. It's like he's very clear about it. And Cornford's argument is, and yet he still has some weird supernatural elements that he himself couldn't detect. So he couldn't purge them from his writing because he took them so for granted he didn't realize they were supernatural elements. And so Cornford spends this book exploring what are these elements that Thucydides can't see in himself. And the element that he puts his finger on is this thing that extends the part that you were talking about and that Heraclitus is talking about in Ethos Anthropoi Daimon. He says the full model that we see in Thucydides and Aeschylus and Sophocles and others is this idea that, yes, your character is your daimon, but the daimon itself has structure. And part of its structure is that it is eager to participate in temporary states of possession. It's eager to be possessed. So, you're trying to have a conversation with your friend in an outdoor cafe, and a shockingly sexy thing walks by right in front of you in a state of disarray. And, almost anybody will at least pause for a moment and go, okay, well, that happened. And less controlled people, will become obnoxious and make wolf whistles and stuff like that. The Greeks talked about this. They said, this is what's happening is you're being momentarily possessed by Aphrodite, right? And if you're aware that you're prone to that possession, then you can do something about it. Like you can learn not to wolf whistle and not to make inappropriate comments and blah, blah, blah. If you don't know yourself, if you're just too proud of your hang on a second, I got to dispense with this cat. She plays fetch. She brings me hair ties. I have to throw them for her. But if you don't know that about yourself, you might just act out what Aphrodite is putting in your head and act inappropriately. Like the whole history of the Trojan War, right? Menelaus and Paris and Helen. Their Aphrodite's hand is very much at work in this. And if any of these people had more self-awareness, enough to understand their liability and to be tempted by Aphrodite, the whole war might not have happened. Is kind of that's part of Homer's argument, right? The same happens with Ares. People in battle who get the bloodlust and they break formation and run out and want to go into single combat, even though they've just destroyed the cosmos of the Greek fighting unit by separating from it. It's like, well, you know, he was possessed by Ares. The bloodlust rose in him. So Cornford's argument is that if you read these guys, you see not just the 12 Olympians, but an enormous cast of additional daimones that might possess you. All of those, and you can Wikipedia this, you look at some of these, they're called personifications. By moderns call them personifications, like, you know, fear, trembling, lust, envy, you know, Eris is there, Ate is there. There's this huge list of what we call abstractions or personifications. And we say, you know, the Greeks didn't really believe in these things. They're just conveniences like cherubs and Baroque art or whatever. You know, we treat them as though to them it's just an aesthetic thing that they run around naming all this stuff. But Cornford says, no, moderns are dead wrong about that. The Greeks took this very seriously. They said, when Pandora opened the box and unleashed the ills on the world, she wasn't just releasing the ills the way a modern thinks of it. She was releasing daimones. And this cast of daimones, this is the extension of the polytheistic Greek religion. The Greeks were expected to learn all of these names because these are the daimones that can afflict you if your character is prone to that particular kind of affliction. And if you've never tested yourself or studied yourself, you don't know which of these can have their way with you. You don't know who you have to be on the guard against. So there's this set of terms that they have. They have a term, and I've forgotten it now. It was only 3 months ago. They have a term for a daimon when it is bringing you illness. The daimon, you know, why do you get sick? You get sick because daimons bring you an illness, and that includes, you know, wasted, you know, hangover. That's a kind of illness. It includes being, you know, out of control. Pride is an illness. Everything bad that can happen to you, the Greeks believed was an illness, and these daimones are possessing you to give you that illness. They believe this is both the core of human psychology and self-knowledge. All the Gnothi Seauton stuff is about this, and also the core of medicine. This is what you have to do, you know, if you want to get somebody to get over the flu, you have to figure out how the daimon got into them and how to drive the daimon out. And you've got medallions and charms, and, you know, all this stuff is built around this idea of repelling the daimons. The other critical part of this that has to be included is all the good things that happen to you are also daimones, right? You inhale, maybe you inhale humility. You were tempted to do something terrible and overreaching, but you had a stroke of luck that your character is not only vulnerable to some bad things, but it's vulnerable to some good things. You can be an empty vessel for hope or humility or courage or, you know, honesty. You breathe that in and then you act, you know, because your character has the structure it has. Maybe the guy sitting next to me is an inveterate liar, and the same breath of honesty passes through, but only I can inhale it because my character is such that it's open to that. So this is the full picture of the Greek concept of human psychology. And this is why they're obsessed with, you got to learn what your liabilities and strengths are. And then you have to not be fatalistic about it, but you have to cultivate your own character through practice to try to close off those weaknesses to, you know, whatever the bad daimones are, and open up, you know, become an empty vessel for the good daimones, so that when they come by, you have this opportunity. They call this kairos, the opportunity, the season, the moment when it makes a difference what you do. There's times in your life where life's chaotic. You could try to do the right thing. You could not try to do the right thing. Either way, it's not going to turn out. But there's other times when if you notice that this is the moment and you act now, it'll make a difference in your life. And so this is part of that self-knowledge, is trying to prepare yourself to develop your character to the point that when the good times come, you're open to them and you can do the right thing. So all of this is built into this idea of parousia. You know, not the medieval concept, but the ancient version of parousia has this idea that you are inhaling or participating in or being possessed by not just the 12 Olympians, but by this huge host of other daimones, some bringing you good things, some bringing you bad things. And you really want to, they had a term for to be guarded, to be on guard, which is only possible if you know yourself. Cornford uses the example of Agamemnon. That tragedy opens weirdly not with Agamemnon or, Clytemnestra or anybody else. It opens on the walls of the town where there's some guards sitting there at night, and they're looking off in the distance, guessing who's coming and what's happening. And Cornford says the reason we start with the guards on the wall is because Aeschylus is talking about human character. He's saying, if you are watchful, then you can be prepared. But if you are unguarded, aphylactos, phylactos means guarded. Aphylactos means, yeah, I'm blithe, I'm disregarding, and as a result, I don't know what's coming, and I'm not prepared when it arrives. So
I think when I translate, I'm most familiar with Jung, and I translate this into becoming the friend and the intimate of your shadow,
yes,
but understanding your relationship, but not being overwhelmed by it.
that's right.
So, yeah,
Right.
thank you very much.
My
Thank you.
pleasure, Donna. It was worth going through again. So there's a. I think there were 5 terms, and the one I've forgotten is the term that means the ills that some daimonists can bring. Charis. The word is care, and a care, K-E-R, and that's a daimon that brings illness, right? And we talked about daimon, and then in theos is the state of possession. And their idea is that we are designed to be possessed. The Homo sapiens, the reason that we can learn to be a fisherman or a farmer or a reindeer herder is because our character, unlike most animals, is designed to be possessed. It's designed to, moderns would say role play, but the Greeks would say that's way too egocentric. That implies it's voluntary. We complete ourselves by drawing off of examples around us, the Greeks believed. So entheos is that state of possession. And then this is the critical term, methixis. This is the possessed person's responsibility for the possession. And the idea is that in the medieval world, there you get a lot of fatalism about demons and demonic possession. It's like, oh, what she could do, she was possessed by demons. Hopefully an exorcist will come along and help her. But the ancients believed possession isn't just a matter of you're the helpless victim and this thing comes and victimizes you. It's you actively participate. You did or didn't cultivate your character to make you open to that possession or guarded against it. You did or didn't develop the self-knowledge to figure out what you should cultivate in your character. And when you're possessed, it's not like you're erased, like in the movie The Exorcist. It's the Greeks would say that's a misrepresentation. Linda Blair's character Regan is still in there and still has responsibility for being a person. Her methixis, isn't erased by the state of possession. She's not a helpless pawn. Everybody has a role to play because the human psychology is so complex that it's not as simple as we either did a thing or we were helpless victims of a thing. It's somewhere in between. It's a mix, an intermingling. But all of this is drawing off this idea of parousia, the ancient concept of parousia. God is right here with us, even in our own skins. Or in the ancient sense, lots of gods, theoi and daimones, are right here in our skins. Interestingly, the medievals are going to end up turning parousia into the shorthand term that they use for the second coming of Jesus. Because they're saying Jesus will be with us again, intimately, he'll be here, back on earth. And so parousia, it's the word, God is not separated, God is going to be with us. So this is what he's alluding to in this. This is why I like unpacking this stuff, right? I mean, he's constantly using these interesting terms that many of which have multiple contradictory meanings depending on which epoch and worldview you're talking about. The ancient parousia versus the medieval parousia. And in the modern sense, we don't even have parousia. We believe the mind is inviolate, and that we're, on the one hand, we think we're the most free inside our skulls, and on the other hand, we believe, but other human beings are just computers and we can program them. You just have to use operant conditioning to make people be what you want. And somehow we believe these contradictory things at the same time by never applying the computer model to ourselves the same way we apply it to people we're trying to manipulate. There's a certain foolishness in the modern world here, a certain self-blindness. All right, so theism, right? We're talking about theism. He continues. Theism feels not just that the gods are in us, but that we are in the gods. Each is permeable to the other and implicates the other, right? The finite and the infinite, as Heraclitus, Aristotle, Aquinas, Hegel, and Kierkegaard all comprehended and wrote about extensively, cannot be exclusive of one another, the way that two finite things can be. So this is one of the things. This is one of the things that moderns have some trouble with. In looking at the universe as a place that's full of things, and things are objects, and two objects can't occupy the same space, we have trouble with the ancient and medieval concept of parousia, which is part of why the ideas drop outside of theology circles. It's dropped away out of modern jargon. We don't talk about it because we don't like it. We want an object to be an object, not to interpenetrate each other as dimensions of existence. Both the ancients and the medievals are comfortable with this concept that God is in us and we are in God at the same time. So he continues, the very divinity and infinity of gods consist in their powers of inclusion and permeation. Right? So the Holy Spirit is in you and you can be in it. Right? The body of, when people talk about people coming together in congregations and churches as becoming the body of Christ, even contemporary Christians who study theology use this same terminology. It's very medieval. That we are, or in Mircea Eliade's sacred and profane concept, we are recreating the sacred time and space through our ritual and our rites. And by doing that, we aren't just mimicking that time and place, we are joining that time and place. And we are suddenly in two times at the same time. We are both in the now when we're doing our ritual, and also we're back at the Last Supper again, sitting down to break bread with Jesus. It's really interesting stuff. And it's part of why these religious ideas have an uneasy existence. Sorry, my cat wants to eat my breakfast. It's part of why these ideas have an uneasy existence in the modern world. You can go to church and talk about parousia and talk about participation in the spirit, and then afterwards you go out and you pay your taxes and you do your job and you follow your laws, and none of that stuff is driven by or respects these concepts of the relationship between the finite and the infinite. So all week long we're practicing an idea that there's nothing infinite, everything is finite. And then we have these moments when we're exposed in philosophical or religious contexts to this deeper, more complex, and frankly more realistic idea that the relationship of the finite and the infinite is interpenetrating and complex. So inclusion and permeation, right? The finite and the infinite. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to ask a question. And I think the concept that of the relationship between the finite and the infinite probably started in Genesis, where he said, and God made man in his own image, spiritually and physically, right? But again, the political nature of religion, where you needed to dominate, excluded that intimacy that we as human beings have with the divine. That's my take on that.
Yeah, that's right. Hang on just a second. Athena. Sorry, we're working on trying to teach her to be less panicky about food. She started out as a feral farm kitten, so she has some habits that in psychological character. She has a character that goes back to those things. All right, so yeah, I mean, you're right. This is you can see it in Genesis. You can also see it in Heraclitus, when he's basically saying the nature around us and the nature within us. He's describing us as amphibians standing on the threshold between two infinities, and one of the infinities is that the cosmos is so much bigger than we are, and yet we're in it, and also it's in us. Carl Sagan, when he does Cosmos, talks about that idea. We are star stuff. You know, the elements of the universe, the elements of the earth are in our very bodies, all the way down. And it's not a big stretch to take it beyond the physical to the psychological and say these concepts are in us, the capacities that far exceed our ability to understand them are in us. When Heraclitus talks about the nature within us, you know, he says basically that you couldn't find the limits of the human mind, even if you spent your whole lifetime searching its pathways, such as its profundity. He's saying there's an infinity inside of us, that this Gnothi Seauton thing is deep. You could spend your whole life, and you should, among other things that you might be doing with your life, you should also spend your whole life trying to explore the cosmos inside us and figure out, how does it work? What is my character? What are my limits and liabilities? What are my strengths? What are my arites? Have I been a programmer all my life, but maybe I should have been a musician? Maybe I should start being a musician now. I mean, you need to explore this stuff. So even though our conscious mind may be finite, it's powered by this potentially infinite unconscious. And when I say infinite, I don't necessarily mean in a mathematical literal sense, but in the uncountable, impractically large sense. We're never going to catch up and even enumerate all the parts within us, because every time we breathe, every time we act, every time we think, our unconscious is growing. It's learning more. It's expanding. And it's always expanding faster than we're cataloging it. So, you know, there's that. And it's influencing us. It's got our character, and it's prone to some daimones and not others. And can we learn that in time to figure out what our character is and to start to shape our lives? So yeah, we're participating in at least two infinities at all times, the one around us and the one inside us. You add the sacred on top of that, and now you're talking multiple dimensions of infinity crossing through, you know, the potentially finite being that is us. Emma, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Welcome to the call. But you got to find your mute button there. There you go.
So can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Oh, great. Okay. So my question, my thought is, I mean, I'm curious because I'm following the conversation, and I drop in maybe once or twice a month just to listen because this is my favorite philosophy podcast, except for Fika. Fika does some great podcasts too. But this is a great philosophy group. And but what I'm hearing, one of the things I'm hearing is that we're kind of tracking this like Aristotelian idea that, like, on the one hand, there's this infinite possibility in the mind. And so, you know, there's this sense that you're supposed to kind of go and explore and do all of these different things to kind of find out what your true character is. But on the other hand, there's kind of the Greek idea that, like, certain people are really meant for certain positions in society. And that was, you know, something that Plato really advocated for, that was always picked up by the Hellenists. And basically anybody who kind of followed the Hellenists really, you know, including into the medieval world, really ascribed to this idea that there's like certain people who are bound by their character and by their virtue, especially by their virtue, to have different positions in society. So, but then when you add to that this question about the infinite of the spiritual, this is what I'm getting at. I mean, I'm a materialist. So for me, there is no spirituality. But I wonder, like, where did we get this idea? I mean, how did this idea move throughout, you know, throughout the Western European history to this place where we have this ridiculous notion that we have something else besides the body? I mean, we have this faith that there's something besides the body, and it's this immaterial and it's infinite, and we think we're connected with it. And it's like, it's just caused so much damage in like Western culture. And I just wonder, like, I mean, why do we keep on clinging to this idea of something besides the body? You know, how did this idea move through the millennia? Because it's not the same idea. Like, the idea we have now isn't the same idea they had then, but it's kind of, but it's expressed the same way. So those are my thoughts. They're kind of random, and maybe they're not connected to the conversation.
They're great thoughts, and they're directly relevant. And I'd love to take some time to talk about it right now, if you're game. I mean, I think I think our people who've been here for the full 2 or 3 years would agree this is the juicy stuff. So let's talk about it. So when we say, that there's no such thing as spirituality, we are presupposing a definition of spirituality. And the definition that we're presupposing is the medieval definition. Like the idea that you don't have a soul, that you only have a body, is based on a rejection of the medieval idea that defines the soul a certain way. Like the soul is the non-corporeal part of you that's at risk and will either go to heaven or hell. And that, you should do, make whatever sacrifice you have to get an eternity of reward rather than an eternity of punishment. And for an atheist in the modern world to say, I don't believe in the soul, what they're saying is, without realizing it, what they're saying is two things. They think they're saying one thing. And I speak as someone who's raised as an atheist. They think they're saying one thing, but they're saying two things because the thing that they're saying presupposes another thing. And you can test me if you think I'm wrong about this. The first thing they're saying that they don't know they're saying is, the medieval Christians are absolutely correct about what the soul is. That's the soul and nothing else. It must be that. But the second thing they're saying is, but I've looked at that and I see no evidence that that exists. And since that exists, therefore the soul does not exist. And the flaw that's built into this is it starts by capitulating the terms of discussion and saying, I'm just going to lose. I'm just going to let the medievals define the world for me. The ancients had a different concept of the soul. We take the Greek concept of the soul, the psyche, the breath that you inhale at birth and that you exhale at death. They say the soul is not a supernatural object that is being threatened with hell or rewarded with heaven. They don't believe any of that stuff. They say the definition is very simple and it can be explained in a way that makes it clear that on the one hand, it's not the body, but on the other hand, of course it's real. And everybody knows it's real. We just don't put a name to it. And the ancients did. But when I say it, you'll recognize it. And it goes like this. 1 minute before I die, you can have a conversation with me. You could play basketball with me. I could cook you a meal. I can do all these interesting things that make it worth having a relationship with me. I have friends because they want this stuff that I'm doing right up until I die. But after I die, I don't do any of those things. I'm not going to cook you meals anymore. I'm not going to sing you songs anymore. I'm not going to host a philosophy seminar anymore. I can't give you a hug. All this stuff that you like is gone. And all that's happened is 2 minutes have passed. The minute before I died and the minute after I died. The sum total of the difference in those 2 minutes is the soul. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying you have a supernatural part of you and it goes to heaven or hell. I'm not saying any of those things. But the ancients said, it's patently obvious that there's a difference. Corpses aren't much fun. You can't go dancing with them. You can't share your thoughts with them. They're not going to give you advice. All of that stops when you die. Something is gone. You don't have to believe that something is supernatural to recognize that something is gone. But you know what isn't gone? Your body. Your body's still here. The difference between 1 minute before death and 1 minute after death is not a difference of mass or material composition. It's a difference of behavior. You get a lot more boring at the end of those 2 minutes. I would get a lot more boring after I die. So they said, the ancients said, so first let us define the soul not as all the things that moderns think it doesn't exist, and don't define it as the things that medievals said it was, but just define it as this. What is the difference between being alive and dead? Because we can all see the difference. And the soul equals the set that includes all that good stuff that we miss out on. The second part of the ancient definition goes like this. If I give you the sign language for I love you, or I give you the sign language for the fuck you that everybody knows, my body is still here. In both configurations, it's the same body. But there's a behavioral difference between I love you and fuck you. Right? It's not a material difference, it's a behavioral difference. And that behavior is real. It's every bit as real as the body is. It just can't be measured with a scale. It has to be measured in some other way. You could use computer modeling and a scanner to try to create a mathematical image of this shape and contrast it with this shape and say the difference between these two in math is that's what the difference is. But you know, the similar thing applies to 1 minute before I die and 1 minute after I die. My body's still identical, but it's behaving differently. Now, the Greeks believed that they thought that the difference was your breath. You stop breathing. You exhale your last breath, your breath goes out of you. They believe that the breath is the soul, that it has the behavior, that explains your behavior. We don't believe that anymore. We think the breath is part of your behavior. But the other part of what the Greeks believed is right on the money. So the medieval argument for the soul is, in modern terms, expressed by kind of modern neo-medieval people, goes like this. And they say, physicists tell us that energy can be neither created nor destroyed, and your life is a kind of energy, so therefore it's impossible to die. You only appear to die. So your body might stop moving, but your life goes somewhere else, and that part that's going is the soul, and it goes to heaven or hell, and those are your choices. This is the medieval argument about what the soul is. The ancients, if there were neo-ancients, people who knew all the modern science, but then tried to use it to explain the ancient worldview, they would say, no, that's not what the soul is. The soul is a song that your body is singing. And your body can only sing that song as long as it's healthy. And all your behavior is the song of your body, right? My ability to hug you, or to explain something on a philosophy seminar, or to cook you a meal. All of that's a song that I'm singing. It's behavior. And the reason that my soul leaves me, quote unquote, when I die, the reason my soul is gone, is that I can't engage in that behavior anymore. I've lost the ability to sing that song. I can't inhale anymore. My medulla oblongata, my cerebellum, they've shut down. And now I don't inhale and exhale, and my heart doesn't beat. And because those things don't happen and all the other things don't happen, therefore I can't give you the behavior that I gave you 2 minutes before that was so interesting, that made me a person. What's interesting about this ancient definition is it doesn't require an energy field or an esoteric supernatural object. It's a material, literal, naturalistic definition that gives the soul all of the importance that the ancients thought it had, not the medievals, but that the ancients thought it had. And doing it all without invoking any kind of theology or afterlife or invisible fields. It is very much like the metaphor of singing a song is very much on the money. Because when I stop singing a song, even though the song is clearly an energy, the energy isn't, the rule of energy not being created or destroyed doesn't apply to my song. Nobody thinks, well, the song must live on. It must have gone to heaven or hell. No one thinks, I wonder where the song went. Is it in this cupboard? Is it under everybody understands the idea that when I stop doing the behavior that produces the song ends, right? Everybody understands that. So it's a small step to get to the ancient concept that all of your behavior, the sum total of your behavior, is the same way. When I die, I stop behaving as a person. I'm now only the body. And without all the behavior that keeps the body going, including metabolic behavior, including systemic behavior like inhaling and exhaling and so forth, and all kinds of things at the cellular level, without all that behavior, I'm no longer capable of singing the song of my body. So this is kind of the general metaphor. A non-supernatural explanation of the soul. Not the Christian soul, but the ancient concept of the soul, psyche. So come off mute, Emma, and let me know if that does anything for you as an explanation, because I'm responding to your question.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so so for me to respond to you, I have another question, and it's in response to what you were saying. It's a hypothetical, so this is just a question.
Yeah, please.
So now imagine that you had all of the latest, like say you went and you talked to Elon Musk, and you said, I want you to build me an avatar, with all of the latest AI. Like, I don't want you to spare any money. I want you to make a complete replica of Elon Musk, of yourself. Make a replica of yourself with like, it's like the brain circuitry is all the same. The muscles are all the same. You have these billions of dollars. You can do it and you program it with the latest AI. So it's like super smart. Maybe it's even smarter than maybe it's like connected to something. So now let's say, okay, now you say, okay, now I want to turn off the original, the human. Maybe he dies at some point. He dies a natural death. And the moment he dies, you turn on the avatar. Now, does the avatar have a soul? According to the ancient definition, does it have a kairos? Does it have a soul? Or is it just a machine? That's kind of my answer to your question.
That's a great
I mean,
question.
to your answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my question to your answer. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the response would be this from the ancient perspective, right? Not talking about the medieval or the modern, but from the ancient perspective, the answer would be everything has a soul. And the reason everything has a soul is that everything has character. The character is the lawfulness of the thing. So, you and I and Sharon and this cat, we all have characters. And if I build a statue of this cat, that statue also has a character. Now, suppose I make the statue hyper realistic and I paint it all to look exactly like the cat, but it's not the cat, it's made of stone. It still has a character, it has its own character, but it doesn't have the character of this cat. It has the character of the stone. And among the things that are different is if it starts raining on this cat's going to come inside. But if it starts raining on the stone lacks the character that would give it the capacity to have that kind of behavior. The stone doesn't relate to the world around it the way this cat relates to the world around her. And so even though they apparently look the same, in truth, they're actually different and have different characters. Now, if we take that a step further and go to your example of somebody makes a simulacrum, like there's a Star Trek episode, a classic Star Trek episode, where Captain Kirk is kidnapped and put on a machine that creates a duplicate of him that looks exactly like him, but it's actually an android. And it's copying his memories, and he's spinning on a big disc. And as it spins, it copies his memories and implants them into the android. And then the androids decide to send the copy of Captain Kirk back to the Enterprise, and he tries to, the androids want to take over the Enterprise. That's their goal. I don't know if you've seen this episode. It's a classic from 1967 or 68. And, I won't tell you how Kirk wins. He manages a clever trick to make sure that the android gets caught by the crew of the Enterprise. They figure out that it's not really him, but it sure looks like him and acts like him in almost every way. Even though it is a nearly perfect simulacrum, the character that it has, the soul that it has, is its own character and its own soul, right? And the moment that one of the things about character is that in living things that have nervous systems like we do, the character is constantly changing. Yeah, what are little girls made of? Thank you. That's the episode, Stephen. The character is constantly changing as we take in new inputs and engage in new behaviors in the world, right? So, if I let's do an example. If I say Athena, you see she looked at me, right? She knows her name. This is new input. And if I go tap, 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 she looks because I often give her treats after I tap. She wants to know, is there a treat there? Why would a treat be sitting there? I don't see a treat there. I think Papa's not actually going to give me a treat. She's not angry. She's still happy because she likes the whole interaction. But this was a new experience. If I had a copy of Athena and it was a perfect simulacrum, and it was in a different room, but I was not with that one. I was here with you guys and her, and she got this input and that one didn't. From that moment, the simulacra begin to diverge, right? They're learning different things. They're experiencing different things. It's why identical twins are never exactly identical in their own psychology and behavior. No matter how much is the same in them, no matter how many things in them converge, the actual life experiences they're having as they separate mean that there's going to be different details. It's part of what's interesting about living systems as opposed to a stone, is that we have this quality called symathesy, in which we're in a nonstop feedback loop learning relationship with the world around us. And that learning relationship is changing our character. The way that the Greeks talk about soul in this context is as follows. They say, you know, if there's very little difference between you being alive and you being dead, then you don't have much in the way of a soul. But everything's got something. Even a stone has behavior. You know, it has a certain stubborn chemical resistance to being changed. You can roll it down a hill and it's still the same stone. But you can break it up into little pieces until it becomes gravel or sand. And now its character has changed. The character of sand is different from the character of stone, even if the sand was manufactured from the same stone. You know, sand can flow, you know, in a semi-liquid way, in a way that a single stone can't do. This is kind of the issue of granularity. And so there are really complex, intricate things going on, even in things that we identify as not alive. In the modern sense, we distinguish alive from dead. There are interesting things going on with character from an ancient perspective, from a Greek perspective, even with these supposedly non-living things. But the moment you get what you're describing, Emma, where you've got a real simulacrum of a living system, they begin to diverge immediately. The copy and the original. You know, two stones that are copies might not diverge much at all, but two living things with nervous systems and sensory organs that are created of each other will begin diverging almost immediately, because they're looking at the world from different angles. They're, you know, one might have a bad day while another one's having a good day, and so forth, until gradually they differentiate, they individualize. All of those distinctions between the things themselves, which the Greeks call character, right? Their ethos, the character that's within them. They say that is, in a living system, the character is stamped onto the soul. And soul is what we all have in common, more or less, while we're alive, that distinguishes us from being dead. But character is what makes us distinctively ourselves. And so we share some character because we're all Homo sapiens and we're all moderns and et cetera, et cetera. But we also have some parts of our character that we don't share because, you know, I might like the episode What Are Little Girls Made Of? And you might not like that episode. We have different things that we're prone to or interested in or taking an interest in. And you mentioned virtue when you asked your first question, and virtue's the typical English translation of the ancient Greek term arete. And what Aristotle understood arete to be is not virtue per se, the way we read it, but as what are your distinctive strengths and excellences that can make possible a distinctive way of life for you. Are you zippy like a cheetah or Speedy Gonzales or Roadrunner? Are you attuned to art like Phil, whose connection dropped and he isn't on the call right now? You know, do you have in you the makings of an anesthesiologist, an interest in the kinds of detailed information and case histories and remembering dosages and what the different effects are in different people and for different durations, you know, that Sharon developed through the course of her medical career. Each of us has a character that's a little bit different from the other person's because of the feedback loops from our arete and so forth. So all of this stuff that isn't just about the body as it lies there on a slab right after you die. Everything else about you falls into the discussion category that the Greeks would call soul or psyche. And all the interesting parts of soul or psyche fall into the discussion of what they would call character or ethos. What about those feedback loops in your soul make you who you are and not who somebody else is? And that's the stuff they think that you should be studying with Gnothi Seauton. Figure out what your character is. And the motivation is what Heraclitus said, ethos anthropoi daimon. Your character has such a huge power over you at an unconscious level, and it's so vast, nigh infinite, that it behooves you to study yourself and figure out what makes you tick. What are you interested in? What are you afraid of? What makes you angry? What's your relationship to pride? What happens when somebody praises you? Now, Ginny's not on the call today, but there have been times when Ginny said, "Oh, Rick, you know, if only you could be president." And I always say the same thing: God help us all. The worst thing that could happen is if I were made president, right? And she doesn't know what I mean by that. But what I mean by, because she just looks at the presidents she doesn't like and says, well, surely you'd be better than that. And I say, but you got to understand, if I had great power, it wouldn't just magnify my virtues, it would magnify my vices. It's because I don't have a lot of power that my vices are not a big problem for the people on this call. They're a little problem, but they're not a big problem. But if I had, a nuclear power, the largest armies on Earth and so forth, everything wrong in my character would become everybody else's problem, right? It would be writ large. So this is that stuff. This is where knowing the body is useful. It's important. All medical science, really takes an interest in it. I mean, martial arts, dance, all kinds of things depend on it. Your health, but most of the difficulties of human existence don't happen at the level of the body. They happen at the level of the body's behavior, what the Greeks call the soul. What did you choose to do with that body? Did you comfort the afflicted, or did you, attack the helpless and vulnerable? These distinctions, you're not going to find them, in the corpse lying on the slab. You're going to find them in the behavior that happens while we're alive during that feedback loop in the psyche. And all of that definition is possible without a single drop of the supernatural, right? Just like I don't need a supernatural explanation to explain my singing a song. Yeah, it may not have mass, but the song can have an effect. Am I singing "We Will Rock You" or am I singing a lullaby? It's going to have an effect on the people in this call. So I hope that's helpful. We'll come back to it. Anytime you come on and you've got questions about it, we can talk about it. But this is what's so interesting. I mean, I was raised by a very atheist father. He was an intellectual atheist. And he went, and a lefty who went through a whole host of, he said every mistake the left ever made, he made. His way of learning how to come up with a reasonable set of opinions was to start with all the unreasonable ones and do them until they were a catastrophe, and then said, oh, wow, that doesn't work, and then move on to the next one. He went through a Leninist period, he went through a Stalinist period, he went through a Maoist period, he went through a Trotskyite period, he went through all of them. This is his life. And I was, and also behaviorism and Skinnerism, and are people just machines and kids are just programmable and you don't have to worry about their feelings, you just have to condition their behavior. We went through all that crap. So I was raised not believing in the soul because I knew that the soul was this crazy supernatural thing that goes to heaven or hell. And I didn't believe in heaven, I didn't believe in hell, I didn't believe in God, so I didn't believe in a soul. And what I didn't understand at any time through that is that my supposed self-empowering disbelief was based on the concept that I had already given away the definition of the soul to the medievals. I said, I'm not even going to argue with you guys. You're right about everything. I'm just going to say no. It wasn't until I was digging through Millennia and Microcosm and the Kenneth Smith stuff that I really started to confront, about 20 years ago, I really started to confront the idea that why should I let the medievals define the soul for me? Who are they to be the boss of me? I thought I was rebelling against them, but I was rebelling against them in a way that tied me to them and made my intellectual world framed in by their intellectual world. And I got exposed to all this Greek stuff, and I started to realize there are entirely different ways to understand human beings. And in some of those ways, the soul is a completely different thing. And the disbelief that I had and the reasons I had for disbelieving in the medieval soul did not actually apply in any way to the ancient soul. I just lumped it in there because of the word soul, which they didn't even use. They called it psyche. It's just the translation that we call it soul. So I'm going on at this about length because I sympathize with what you said, Emma. I mean, I recognize it and I sympathize with it. And there is an interesting possibility whenever we're doing philosophy or politics or anything else that's really juicy and meaty. You can argue with people that you disagree with, or you can agree with people that you think you agree with. But another interesting tack is to step back and go, how has this conversation been framed? What definitions are we using? What are we assuming about the way people work and the way nature works? And is there a sacred? And if so, how does that work? And if we step back and look at that framing, sometimes we find that the real freedom and potential in a conversation doesn't lie in the way that it was phrased for us to try to invite us into a particular kind of argument or agreement. Sometimes it lies completely outside of it. This idea that there are important things about people that can't be summed up as the body, but that don't require a supernatural explanation. It was like obvious to the Greeks and completely oblivious to me for 40 years of my life. I simply never imagined. I never imagined explaining myself and my behavior that way until I encountered the Greeks, and it just blew my mind. Anyway, Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I've tried to regather my thoughts. The soul versus and the spirit. For most of my adult life, and I still have my adult life here, that's a concept. Those two different entities are ones that I try to figure out how they impact our humanity. Now, the soul has a concept which is not unique to Christianity. There's the soul in Hinduism, and it keeps coming back until it gets perfection, right? And the soul, as you go from the ancient times to the medieval times to the modern times, it changes its concept.
Yes.
It changes the way people see it.
Yes.
But the soul is an entity, as you said, which really defines our character. It has our emotions and our appetites. Now, the spirit is the part of humanity that I think is very interesting, because this is the operative part. This another operative part. This is the part that connects you to God. And in fact, in Galatians chapter 5, Paul talked in his letter to the Galatians, he talks about the fruits of the Spirit, which is how the Spirit operates, which is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, trustworthiness. That's the operative nature of the Spirit. And that, I think, is the part that God made you in his image. So this is a fascinating discussion. Now, that was a medieval concept, right? And so I looking at Hegel, and I'm trying to look at the phenomenology of the spirit, and I can't understand it. I'm getting there, though, you know? I don't understand what he's talking about, because I come at it from that very, very basic concept. But these are evolving perceptions. That's all I can say about that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. When it comes to Hegel, my recommendation is don't start with the phenomenology of Geist. Start with the philosophy of Geist. The philosophy of Geist is what he wrote later for his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. I think it's book 3 of the philosophy of Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. It's much simpler. It's easier to follow. It was his attempt to basically write the Cliff's Notes version of the phenomenology of Geist. And when you get the philosophy of Geist, you can get it in 2 editions. The pure edition that only has the philosophy of Geist is not the one you want. You want the one that, in addition to having what you might think of as Hegel's Cliff Notes on his own concept of the Geist, there's one that includes literal class notes taken by Hegel's students. He used to, he'd give the explanations orally in class, and they would take notes. And so those notes capture some of the oral discussion that went alongside the written philosophy of Geist. And if you put those 2 together, you get a much clearer picture of his idea of Geist. Once you're armed with that and you're comfortable with it, you can go back and reread, the phenomenology of Geist. And now it makes more sense. So that's my recommendation for the way you go at this. Let me see if I can find you the name of the notes that go with the philosophy of Geist. I was transcribing it.
Because the concept of spirit in the theological sense, in my mind, I think it's pretty resolved. But in the philosophical sense, the descriptive nature of it I find fascinating.
Yes. Yes, it's intriguing. Here we go. Let's see if I've got the name for it. I can't remember. It's a word that starts with Z. that's used for the notes that came alongside it. Anyway, if you Google for it and look for it, you'll find it. And of course,
Yes, okay.
what's complicating the picture here is of course that in German, Geist doesn't only mean spirit; it also means
Yes.
mind and spirit at the same time. And in German, they're together. And there are plenty of languages like English where mind and spirit are two completely different things. And it's a little weird for us, this idea that they're dependent on each other.
And
I,
sometimes I get the impression that mind could mean soul. All depends on who you're reading, because that's part of your appetite and part of your emotions.
yes,
So it gets a little very confusing for me at my level of knowledge.
I think it's Susetsa. I think that's the word you're looking for. It's Susetsa, which are the class notes that go with the philosophy of Geist.
Okay.
So get an edition that includes the Tsusetsa. Don't get the pure edition that's only the text. And effectively, by getting the Tsusetsa, you're getting class note versions of his oral lectures that went alongside the text. And it's much more, they fill out a lot more of the explanation of what the hell is he talking about. When he wrote Phenomenology of Geist, he wasn't all that concerned with being understood. He was really concerned with, he wanted to have a fist fight with Kant. And so he's trying to write a book as tough-minded philosophically as Kant's books were. And the consequence of that is that it's very difficult to understand. It's so difficult to understand that he himself, when he finished writing it, decided it was too difficult to understand. And then he wrote the foreword to the Phenomenology of Geist. And the foreword is a Cliff's Notes of the rest of the book of the Phenomenology of Geist. But later he decided that too was too difficult. And so he wrote the Philosophy of Geist. So if you work your way through the Philosophy of Geist and then read the foreword to the Phenomenology and then read the Phenomenology, you're in good shape. But
Okay.
but where this is relevant, he's studying the Greeks. He's studying Greek philosophy intensively, and he's trying to update it into German. And he's using very specific German terminology to try to, for every critical ancient Greek term, he's finding an equivalent German term that maps onto it. And when you figure out what his mapping is and what he's mapping to, you can begin to get the sense of the way that he's using the German language in very precise ways. And one of in the Philosophy of Geist, for example, you can spot where, if you have the English and German side by side, you can spot where he actually quotes "Know thyself" from the Oracle of Delphi. And as you know, in the Greek, gnothi from gnosis is a totally different operation from the operation noesis. And to the Greeks, that's the critical part of gnothi seauton, is that you have to know that it through via gnosis and not via noesis. Well, he makes that same distinction in German. So when you find his translation of gnothi seauton, you can see which German verb he's using that he's equating to gnosis. And then by process of elimination in some of the surrounding sentences, you can see where he's contrasting it with noesis, and you see what German term he's using for noesis. And now you've got the pair that's equivalent to gnosis versus noesis. You've got the German pair, the one versus the other. So this is kind of, and all this, none of this comes through in the English translations. You've heard me whine before about English translations of Hegel. This is an example of what they don't do. They just translate it all into English and call it ideas and notions, and it's almost gibberish. So don't blame yourself if you're having a hard time understanding it. First of all, he thought he wrote it too complicated too, and that's why he later wrote the Philosophy of Geist. But second of all, the translators are just wrecking all his fine distinctions by turning it into English. It's kind of a mush by the time they're done with it. If I live long enough, I intend to write a translation of the Philosophy of Geist and the foreword to the Phenomenology, in which I try to be very precise with the words so that we don't lose the distinctions that Hegel's trying to make. Because without those distinctions, I don't know how anybody's supposed to understand him. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the first part of the text that you put in the chat. Christianity originated as a plebeian or lower class cult
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. In the early empire, Christianity started to be persecuted maybe as early as 120 AD. They'd already ran the ire of the Roman authorities by then. Some claim earlier, but that could be made up. We don't know. So I'm just wondering, because to me that seems to contradict the actual history. Thank you.
It's a great question, Stephen. So I was reviewing some of this last weekend on Saturday. What we see is in the first century, Christianity is barely distinguishable from Judaism because Judaism has a lot of different flavors, a lot of different sects, and Christianity at first just seems like another sect. In fact, not one of the bigger ones within Judaism. It takes a while to grow. And it's spreading among the lower classes at that point for sure. But there's little pieces of the history that are lost or confused. So one of the critical pieces is that it's 70 AD is when Rome conquers Judea, Palestine, and trashes the temple at Jerusalem. And part of what they're doing is the Romans see how fanatical the Jews are about fighting back against the idea that the Caesar is a god on earth. They find that offensive as hell. The Romans are willing to say, you can have a lot of flexibility in your polytheism. They're used to polytheistic cultures. They're saying you don't have to worship all our gods. You don't have to worship all our gods all the time. You don't have to do all this stuff. But at least you have to recognize that Caesar is a god on earth. You know, if you can't recognize that Caesar's a god on earth, you're basically directly confronting the political stability of the empire. And the Jews are like, the last thing on earth we're going to do is call a human being a god. To us, that's, horrific. That's a horrific thing to believe. So it makes them very fierce in their fight against Rome because they think that this is an issue of, religious commandment. They have to fight back. And for that reason, among others, when the Romans conquered Judea, they smashed the temple at Jerusalem. So they're like, we have to break the back of the priestly caste. That's the source of all these freedom fighters / terrorists, all these people who refuse to submit to Roman law. The three emperors that were associated with that were the Flavian emperors, the Flavian dynasty, which came after the earlier Julian dynasty. And I think there was a period of turmoil before the Flavians kick in. And the Flavians, this part of the history is nearly lost, although you can find it in the recent book, Creating Christ. The Flavians actually support the nascent Christian religion. There's a lot of evidence of this. It was covered up later, partly by the Romans themselves. The later dynasties were not keen on what the Flavians did. They wanted to go back to being Greco-Roman. They didn't want all this Jewish stuff mixing in with their peanut butter, if you will, the old commercial, the peanut butter and the chocolate. So they erased some of the history and they rolled back some of the stuff, but there's still evidence that shows the Flavians basically gave imperial cover to the Christian religion. And part of the reason they did that is they were trying to offer Jews an alternative to the violent sects that insisted on fighting back against the Romans. They said, you don't have to be violent. Look at these Christians. They're Jews and they're all peaceful. They all turn the other cheek. They pay their taxes, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Don't you want to be more like them? We're gonna keep punching the Jews for fighting us back, but this particular Jewish sect, any Jew that wants to be part of that sect, we won't persecute them. We're going to give them cover. We're going to be nice to them. We all see, and part of the evidence of this is that we've all heard of the fish symbol, the two lines that make the fish, and the story about how the Christians had to be in hiding, and so they'd quietly make the fish in the sand underneath, and they'd nod, and then they'd erase it so nobody knew. Well, the fish symbol doesn't show up until the 2nd century on Christian tombs. But in the 1st century, starting around 70 with the Flavian dynasty, all the early Christian catacombs and tombs, they have the anchor with the 2 dolphins winding around it. That's the symbol that's used on Christian tombs, not the fish. And the anchor with the 2 dolphins is the imperial crest of the Flavian emperors. The reason they're putting it on their tombs is to say the Flavian emperors have blessed this sect of Judaism. And, if you are angry at Jews and want to trash a Jewish house or a Jewish tomb, not these ones, or you'll get in trouble with the emperor. The emperors got the back of the Jews who decide to be Christians. So long before Constantine, there's a period of imperial cover. And the other thing that was found during that time is Roman coins that have mottos on them that say, peace on earth, goodwill to men. All those things we associate with Christmas. The Flavian emperors start producing coins that have those things on them. They're trying to encourage now that we've conquered you, let's all be peaceful.
Okay, but the Flavians aren't the late empire.
No, but we're talking about a transitional period. So when we're talking about persecution versus not, Nero had a period where he was persecuting some Christians. I think later, is it Domitian? I can't remember who it is that persecutes some more Christians. There's some periods, but there's also periods of cover where the Christians are absolutely not only are they not being persecuted, they're being conspicuously not persecuted while other Jewish sects are being persecuted in the hope of doing sort of a Skinnerian carrot and stick approach to pushing people out of being freedom fighters and into being peaceful Christians. So there's some complicated history here. The 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. It gets very complex. And a lot of it is stuff that we don't know that hasn't been taught to us in school. You have to look at the latest research. So for a while, it is spreading among the lower classes. I think you're right that it doesn't really start spreading among the Roman army until you get Constantine. And Constantine makes it the official religion. And now, because it's the official religion, or one of the official recognized religions, now the armies are carrying it where they go. So
I could be wrong, but I'd even suggest that the soldiery remains pagan longer than other parts, other aspects of this Roman society. A lot of the soldiers were barbarians that had been hired.
yes,
You go and show them a huge statue of Zeus and they'll think, oh yeah, that's sort of like what I believe in.
yes,
Then you
yes,
show them some Christians and they're going to think, oh, that doesn't work.
yes. And there's no doubt that this sentence is an oversimplification. The history is very complicated. It's kind of really my point. On my list to read, I don't know if I'll get to it this year, it might be next year, is Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he goes into so much more detail about this. Because for Gibbon's concerned that Christianity itself leads to the fall of the Roman Empire. That's his theory that he pushes in that, was it 5 volumes? His 5-volume work on Rome. So he's going to talk clearly about who was and wasn't a Christian at which points during the empire. I think that's where I'm going to get my sources.
Well, that's a big question, because did Constantine revive the empire? Yeah, it seemed to be going along fine for a little while, and then the Huns show up to ruin everything. They didn't behave like the other barbarians.
Yes.
The other barbarians, they're a bit more reasonable. But the Huns seem to have some sort of a different idea.
Yes. Well, they're a completely different kind of culture, aren't they? I mean, they're related to the Finns. And you know what the Scandinavians say about the Finns. They're all throughout history, the Vikings are like, we're going to conquer the world, but not the Finns. They're a little creepy. They give us the willies. They're scary. Those Finns, you don't know what they're going to do next.
They worship strange gods.
Yes, and they speak a strange language, and they have
Yeah, well, they claim that the Huns were Turkic, which would relate, I suppose, to the Finno-Ugarian sort of element. Of course, the Hungarians showed up and created a great shock. I remember one historian was going, well, this was a time the Islam was giving Christianity a hard time. Then the Vikings showed up. Finally, the Hungarians showed up, and Christianity's misery was complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's the hard thing about writing summaries of this period is, you're talking about 500, it's half a millennium of history. There's an enormous amount of shifting and changing and complexity in that. So it's part of why, I want to take our time and unpack this stuff is we can, you, me, and everybody else on this call, we can bring the things that we learn from outside of this into the history and kind of round it out more. Get it.
Well, you can draw the short straw and be the one to take the revision note to Kenneth.
Yes. Happy to. Although you have to be careful because given a chance, Kenneth will rewrite the whole thing. he's always dissatisfied with his earlier versions. Emma, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on Joseph Atwell's book, Caesar's Messiah?
I'm not familiar with those books. Joseph
Okay.
Atwell?
Yeah. It's. I mean, some mythicists, basically think it's just kind of junk pop BS. But it's an interesting idea. I mean, the idea is that Josephus, and Flavius Caesar co-conspired to write the Christian Gospels, basically as a way of trying to basically do what you were describing, which is to create a new sect of Judaism, a sect that was loyal to the empire. And I've always found it really interesting because I have family that's both Jewish and Christian. And so I grew up very familiar with both traditions. And Atwell's book is really fascinating. I mean, like I said, the mythicists don't like it. They think it's bullshit. So I don't know. They're historians. It's still a fun read. It's really interesting.
Well, thank you for bringing it to my attention. I will definitely read it. I really enjoy reading fantasy alternate histories about these periods that I'm really interested in. And clearly there's some overlap here with the premise from the book Creating Christ, which is interesting. So we'll see how it goes. I can see why you bring it up. I hadn't heard of this before. And this was written before Creating Christ was written. So I'm starting to wonder if this influenced that. Very curious. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'll check it out. All right, let's dive back into the text. So we're continuing our discussion of theism. We talked about the finite and the infinite being permeable to each other. And we are almost done with paragraph 7 and about to start paragraph 8. So let's do this last sentence from paragraph 7, where Kenneth says, theism as such a pantheism is a sophisticated heir to primitive animism, to the wonder that all things are alive with gods who are evident and existent. So this is a chewy sentence. There's a lot here. But a lot of it we've talked about before, and we're just going to gesture in the general direction. So when he talks about primitive animism, this is Cornford's hypothesis in From Religion to Philosophy, that book. And he mentions it as well in Thucydides' Myth Historicus. This idea that the pantheon of Greek gods, the Olympians, says Cornford, were a recent addition on top of a much older strata of ancient Greek religion. He says the evidence is that the ancient Greeks originally had a daimon religion, and where they didn't have gods, they had daimones. And it's just daimones everywhere. He says, you can see that they never stopped talking about daimones through the whole period. He says, even Thucydides, trying to give up the gods, still implicitly believes in daimones. And so that appears to be the older, stronger stratum of the Greek religion. That idea that there are daimones in everything. Each person, like Donna was saying earlier, I think it was that the human character is like a daimon. Each of us has a daimon. That's one source of daimones, but also every tree, every rock, every spring, every waterfall, every fertile field, they're all daimones. And it's why I think it's Thales' third proposition, that there are gods everywhere. Everything is gods. The whole there's nothing that isn't sacred. There's something sacred about everything. And this starts to sound like, on the one hand, it sounds like the Japanese religion, Shintoism, right? That there's spirits, kame, everywhere. It also sounds like traditional Navajo beliefs. As you may recall, when European invaders moved into Navajo territory and encountered Navajo for the first time, at first they thought they were all heathens who didn't have a religion. They thought they were atheists. And they thought that because there were no sacred buildings, there were no sacred sites set aside to say this is the sacred site. There weren't a sacred class that they could identify of people who dressed in special robes and said, we're the sacred ones. There wasn't a sacred day set aside. And it took them a long time to figure out the reason they didn't have one sacred church or one sacred day is because the Navajo thought it was all sacred. And everything is sacred. Everything matters. Everything participates in these issues of the sustainable versus the unsustainable. What are the things you should do and what are the things you should not do? The Navajo thought every moment of your life is a sacred moment. And so that's why they wouldn't set aside Sunday as being the one and only time when you should be a good person. They're like, you should always be a good person. And in hindsight, you see the craziness of saying God wants us to be good, but mainly for 2 hours on a Sunday morning. So this idea, when he talks about primitive animism, he's alluding to this pattern all over the world, which was apparently an early stage in the development of religion that was shared by many different cultures that came up with it on their own. This idea that the world matters, the things in the world matter, everything that affects us matters. They're all we go from thinking before we encounter primitive animism, when our only real exposure is to things like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, it's easy to imagine that that's normal. And that's how most religions have worked throughout time, because they're the ones we're most familiar with. It takes a while to clue in that in fact, the idea of setting aside a special priest, a special building, a special day, that's not normal. That's a weird innovation. The normal thing is to look around the world and say, this isn't a meaningless world with a few sacred things in it, the sacred and the profane. This is a world in which everything is sacred, right? You don't know what's going to matter. Anything might matter. You have to be very, very careful. You have to always have your lights on and be in your mind and be paying attention and be alive to the significance of the world that you're living in. That's primitive animism. The reason everything has a spirit is because everything has a character. Everything's got a nature of its own, and you have to pay attention to what that nature is. So from there to pantheism, the idea of a whole bunch of nature gods that were worshiping nature, this idea of the wonder that all things are alive with gods who are evident and existent. Thales says as much straight up, and he's often cited as the first Greek philosopher. So this is what he's saying is we're used as moderns, when we think about theism and deism, if we know the terms at all, we're used to thinking about them in terms of the founding fathers of the United States or contemporary preachers or contemporary theology, and that those are the normal frame of reference for what we're talking about. But in this sentence, he's basically saying By theism, throughout this essay, he does not mean what a modern means by theism. He's taking us all the way back to the ancient Greek religion and its forebears and saying by theism, that's what he means. And that's why he talks about the parousia as being critical, as the critical ingredient of theism, that the sacred is with us and we're in it. The world is sacred. Everything in the world is sacred. And it's not at a distance from us. So far, so good. That's theism. Let's turn to deism. This is paragraph 8, right? Let's drop paragraph 8 in there. Para 8. Because we gotta look at the second half of his comparison and contrast here. All right, there's the text. Let me get a little sip here. All right, ready? In contrast to theism, deism, however, conceives that the gods are remote, implacable, abstract, and faceless powers, no more moral or just in human terms than are the forces of nature. So before we go on, we can say, for example, the Titans. Ancient Greek religion maintains the memory of an earlier pantheon of deities before the Olympians called the Titans. And the Titans represent things like time and space, and the ocean, and they rule, say Homer and Hesiod and others, they rule by force. They're more powerful than we are. They're like giants, and you have to watch out for them. God knows what they're going to do. They're not particularly concerned with us, and it's our job to keep our eye on them so they don't step on us. And when the new Olympian religion arises, it arises by overthrowing the old Titanic religion, and it overthrows it very consciously. You can find places in the Greek myths where they actually proselytize and tell you why is the Olympian religion, why do they think it's better than the Titanic religion? And one of the core arguments, which is in Aeschylus's plays, in the Oresteia, the Agamemnon, and especially like the work on Orestes and his trial. They talk about Aeschylus talks about the idea that under the old Titanic religion, might made right, and if somebody harmed you, the only justice there could be would be for you to harm them, and this is how you got these generational wars that never ended, because every time you try to amend a past wrong, you did it under the Titanic value system by creating a new wrong in reaction against the old wrong. And the consequence of that is an eye for an eye, making the world blind. The trial of Orestes is built around this idea: was he right or wrong to kill Clytemnestra for having killed Agamemnon? And Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon for sacrificing Iphigenia. So there's this sense of one catastrophe leading to the next catastrophe that's built into the old might makes right religion. And there is a passage in Orestes around the trial where they say there is a new religion, the Olympian religion, and under the Olympian religion you can solve problems other than by returning a past wrong with a new wrong. There's a new kind of justice. They say we have a new god, Zeus the Redeemer. And Zeus the Redeemer is freeing us from the endless cycle of vengeance and introducing us to a new kind of justice in which there can be forgiveness and compensation, recompense, and the making of peace. And so that's what they do with Orestes. They break the cycle of death, and they don't execute Orestes for killing Clytemnestra, for killing Agamemnon, for killing Iphigenia, for blah, 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 blah. They break the cycle of vengeance. And they do that because unlike the Titanic gods, who are these great Titanic forces, the Olympian gods are personal gods. And they are very concerned with human beings. And they rule not by force, but by persuasion, Peitho, the goddess of persuasion. And that's why Aristotle says there is a statue, to the charities above the agora where they do trade, because they don't want any part of human behavior or human society to reduce down to brute might makes right, or screw over your neighbor to get a percentage. Everything should be centered on what is the most humane thing to do, what is the most sustainable thing to do, where is this all leading? And that requires a personal religion that's not driven by abstraction and implacability and force. it's driven by thinking, what is the best possible outcome and how do we get there from here? Right? Which is why Orestes is forgiven for his matricide, for his murder of his mother. He's saying, if we just keep doing this, it's never going to end. It has to end somewhere. So we need a new kind of justice. All right, so he's alluding to that a little bit there when he's talking about the faceless, implacable, immoral deities of the past. And he's saying deism is deism is more like the Titans than it is like the Olympians. He says, it is a religion of alienation and futility, whether as determinism, fata, or as blind chance, fortuna. Sorry, Joe's not here. He would love this. We've got a dialectic between fata and fortuna, determinism and blind chance. Are things inevitable, driven by necessity, ananke, or are they random? Fortuna, it's luck. And you would think that you get people arguing about which side of that they want, without realizing that everywhere on that spectrum and both ends of it are still a kind of trap. Because if it's blind chance, it doesn't matter what you do. It's luck that's going to determine the outcome. But likewise, if it's determinism, it also doesn't matter what you do. You don't have a choice. It's all determined. And neither of these is there room for human will. And if you don't have room for human will, you don't have any morality. It doesn't matter what you do. It has to be possible for people to have a meaningful engagement with the world where you can make a difference. You don't ignore necessity and you don't ignore random chance, but you make room for those plus human agency and will. And that's sort of the full Greek perspective. But as he's saying here, under deism, you've pulled out the human element and you're left with determinism or blind chance. He says, it's a world that's more metaphysical than moral, more intellectual and desperate than pious and full of gratitude for the bounties of a rich existence. And this is contrasting deism with theism. And I'll call on Stephen in just a second. He says, deism's aloof and inhuman divine powers naturally decay over centuries into a deus absconditus who has abandoned God. And that kind of deism was the kind that most of the founding fathers of the United States had. The clockwork God who creates the universe, winds up the universe, and then lets it go. And the natural laws determine everything that happens after that. This is the God of Newton. And this is the God that scared Kant. He wanted to rescue a theistic God who matters morally from the inevitability of a God of billiard balls that he was afraid Newton was giving us. That kind of deism was definitely baked into the way that the US Constitution, political economy was created. They were created mostly by deists. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the split between the Western and Eastern churches on an issue, and the Hermetics and the some of the earlier thinkers would talk about body, soul, and spirits. And the Western church, the Latin church, seemed to adopt the position, okay, I know I've got a body, and I know I've got a mind which seems to be a bit invisible, but it's there. What the hell is a spirit? And the Western church more or less banned the idea of an individual spirit in a person. Okay, you got a soul and a body. Your body falls away and the soul goes to God. Although the Eastern church continued with the idea of the spirit. So some say it's connected with the sort of spiritual practices the Eastern church would engage in while the Western Church was a bit suspicious of people who prayed excessively. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's going to be a recurring theme over the next 2 years as we talk about the relationship of soul and spirit to each other under the medieval framework, and then compare and contrast it with the ancient framework. Kenneth famously said, "Spirit is soul in motion," in one of his quotes. But what exactly that means and how it applies is going to take some doing. Part of what's interesting about the development of the orthodoxy that became sort of the center of the medieval power structure, the theology, is it starts out with a family, a mother, a father, and a son. But by the time the misogynists are done with it, the patriarchs in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the mother's nowhere to be found. You've got the father, the son, and a ghost, or a spirit. And as you're pointing out, that Western approach to the orthodoxy is pulling the spirit out of all of us and saying it only really resides in the Holy Spirit. And we participate in the Holy Spirit, but it's not our spirit to have.
I rewrite it as the granddad. Yeah. Because that was an organisation in the that culture, that you had the son, which was the junior, who's been brought up in the world. Then you had the senior, who was, especially in fighting, if you're a warrior, you had a son, you're training your son, you're the warrior, you're at the best stage, you're at the strongest. And then there's granddad, who's a bit past it, who was a warrior, but he knows a lot of stuff.
The wise guy.
Yeah, so, a lot of these warrior was a three-man team. You had the apprentice, the knight, and then the old knight who wasn't quite there anymore in the sense of being a warrior. But he had done it all. He had something to say. He could still do a few things.
Thank you, Stephen. I had not thought about the Holy Spirit as grandpa. That's a really interesting metaphor. I'm going to chew on that. We're going to see over the next few years so many variations on how to interpret these things. I'm not going to take us into talking about Markion today, but I really want to because it's so relevant here. Instead, I guess I'll do a moment on Mariolatry and say that despite the fact that the proto-Orthodox pulled the mother out of the picture and replaced her with the Holy Spirit, pretty much for the next 1,000 years, people kept trying to put her back in. And Mother Mary, as an intercessor to God, and even as an intercessor to Jesus, as being the one that people reached out to the most and revered because of her compassion, her overwhelming, love, became this huge figure in the Middle Ages. And the medieval orthodoxy really struggled with her because on the one hand, it brought a lot of people into the church, but on the other hand, it seemed to shift the balance away from severe extreme patriarchy into almost matriarchy, and they weren't having any of that. The main orthodoxy of the medieval church detested women and wanted them to shut up and sit down and be obedient, wouldn't allow them to hold power structures. And when we say wouldn't allow, what we really mean is they used to hold power structures. At the time of Paul, they held power structures. At the time of Jesus, they held power structures. But by the time we get to the new orthodoxy that rises and becomes the medieval church, they've been completely expunged and turned into, domestic labor. So it's understandable that there'd be a big pushback for the next 1,000 years of people trying to put the mother back into the picture. There are, we discussed earlier, I think, with Donna, we discussed this question of kind of what ends up in the canon and what doesn't end up in the canon, and the different pressures and compromises that were involved in trying to weld together all these different factions into one faction that's big enough to secure imperial patronage and eventually inherit the empire. All of that realpolitik, that pragmatism that was involved in the formation of that orthodoxy resulted in a theology that's full of seams. It's full of seams, places where things have been welded together, sometimes that don't really fit. And that's how you end up with three gods in one. Just like we've got three different factions here, and somehow we have to get them to be one faction, so we'll put them all in the same pot. And the number of arguments and the intensity of arguments that happens over the centuries that follow over what does it mean to have a three-in-one God? Is it polytheism in disguise? Is it monotheism? Is it neither monotheism nor polytheism? What the hell is it? People are burned over this. It's a major issue. They can't stop fighting about it. But those fights are the natural consequence of the political ambitions of the proto-Orthodox group and the way that it welded disparate theologies together and tried to make a composite out of them. Anybody who writes software, like Donald and I, totally understand what it's like when you take completely foreign pieces of software and weld them together and try to make them work as one. And then pretty soon you discover they're all using different variable names for the same thing, or they're using the same variable name for different things. Every time you call one of the others, he steps on your variables, you step on his variables. It's like, oh my God, there's just collisions result when you have different idioms forced to co-occupy the same space. And that defines, that's the subtext underneath the medieval theology. There is an enormous tug of war going on for how are we going to hold all these things together as one, when in fact there are a bunch of different things that we've forced together for the sake of pragmatism and power. All right. Well, we still got time. Let's finish paragraph 8. Is God a free, inconsistent person, liable to reverse his decisions, to be softened in his judgments by prayer, to repent of his overreactions? This part of the sentence is saying, is it a theistic God? Is it a humane God? Is it a emotional, personal God that you can relate to and have a conversation with, who might care about you? Or a rigorous and unitary metaphysical principle, necessitarian and lawful? And that second part is a more intellectual, deistic God. So there's a gnosis noesis thing going on here. To have a personal relationship requires gnosis. To have pure crystalline mathematical logic and inevitability, that's noesis. That's the goal of noesis. So that I think Stephen's pointed out before in previous calls, there's a split between the Western and Eastern church that lasts for most of this period, in which the Western church is more noetic and intellectualizing. In fact, they reach a point where they come to summarize God as mind, as logic. They either say that is the language of God or the mind of God, or that is what God is the intellect. So far do they push towards noesis. But meanwhile, on the Eastern side, they believe in a more experiential religion, right? They think that, religious ritual can't just be lectures and lectures set to music. It has to include an emotional, experiential component. And that has to be a major part of it. And they still, to this day, the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, these Orthodox churches and others, they say that's one of their big differences from the Western Roman Church, is their approach to ritual is more gnosic. No, gnosis is part of the whole picture. It took the scrupulous reasoning of Spinoza to unmask these incoherencies of Christian theology. I got to say, suddenly I'm a lot more curious to read some Spinoza. I don't know if I'll do it in this 2 years or after, but the schizophrenia of moral, theist, and metaphysical, deist, dimensions in its notion of divinity. They're incompatible with each other. They're really two different religions that its ancient critics had also foreseen. Donna, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Could we just this is a request, could we please talk about Spinoza next time? I know we're running out of time now, but this is another question I've been living for decades now. why more people aren't paying attention to him. I can understand with his writing and what he's done with his writing, because I thought it was kind of wild too. But I would love to talk about him more next time, okay?
Yeah,
That's my request. That's all I ask.
we will definitely put Spinoza on the list. I don't know
Thank you.
if it can be next time or if it's got to be a little later.
Okay.
We might need more wind up and immersion in the thing that he's critiquing in order
Okay.
to make sense of his critique.
And also his writing, it's like, whoa. You know? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for the next 1,500 years, what we're going to run into over and over is people whose dominant philosophical writing involves trying to either rationalize or disentangle this theology, because the theology has so much power; it affects so many people, it can't be ignored. It's the elephant in the room. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I would like to know what Donna finds about Spinoza. It's one of the few classes I had a graduate seminar in, and we did Spinoza's Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order. And at that time, I was primarily a math student, and I can tell you, every proof in there is correct. I checked them all. You know, it has no content. It is perfectly noetic. It is an empty structure, but
Could
wonderfully done. Huh?
Could I quickly respond? Do we have time, or do you want to go into this or not?
Well, I just want to know what in Spinoza? Do I need?
Okay.
Should I
have to
prepare or not?
No, you have to understand my background is I studied architecture, physics, geometry. My paintings still have a geometric structure often, and that's the residue from studying architecture. So when he hit me in my 40s, when I started reading him, I could not put it all together, just like I can't often put together my paintings from their geometrical structure to their abstraction. And that's not saying it very well, because I'm obviously still living the mystery. I loved Spinoza and what he was saying, but putting it all together, I can't put it all together yet. Sorry,
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I can either. I only read the one book, and it was different from any other philosophy work. It's the kind of thing that Whitehead might have written, or something.
Architecture is like sacred geometries, attempting sacred geometries on the earth, which never happens. It never does. There's no true right angle or anything like that. However, you still keep attempting it in that profession, But it's like, and here
Okay.
knows they're doing this with philosophy, and I thought, oh wow, how did anybody even listen to him at that point in history? I don't know. It's still a mystery. It's another one of the mysteries to me. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, that's all I can say about it.
Thanks, Donna, and thanks, Donald. Yeah, 1600s, 1700s, with Spinoza, we're definitely talking about the transition into modernity. And so we'll talk about it some, but maybe more in the modern section than in the medieval section. Because like Pico della Mirandola, he's one of those who's going back and recapitulating the previous 1,500 years and critiquing it and trying to, rationalize it. And that's more understandable after we've spent time in the material that they're trying to critique and rationalize. I haven't read much Spinoza. I've read about him some, but I haven't read much of him, so I'm not prepared at all. But hopefully, over the next couple of years, while we work our way through the medieval stuff, it'll help prep me more. Stephen, come off mute. What's on your mind?
Oh, this is quite off topic. I was just going to ask if you could recommend any works on axiology. It doesn't seem to be something that's brought up in philosophy a great deal. It was something that was early 20th century. So I'm doing a Zoom on value theory and axiology. There's a guy that's written a few books about it, but I'm just not sure. I get the feeling somehow he might have strayed from the true path. So is there a book on the axiology which understands its true path?
Yeah, I'm if I get around to writing philosophy books, a book on axiology is one of the 3 books I want to write. And for the same reason you're talking about. It is a interestingly neglected area for something that's such a central topic in philosophy. And perhaps it's not an accident that it's neglected. Perhaps it's because it runs directly counter to the nihilist pragmatist framework of modernity, which says you shouldn't have axiological concerns. You should just figure out how to get what you want in the most efficient way possible. You shouldn't be asking yourself whether it's wrong to want that. I'm with you. Axiology, I think, is a neglected area.
Well, many would disagree with me, but from my perspective, rational thought is a value determining type of thought. You can have ideas, you can have all sorts of ideas, but from my perspective, which runs counter to the normal definition of rationalism, my basic premise of rationalism is it's that type of thought which looks at ideas and tries to say, well, certain ideas are valuable, others not so valuable. Some ideas are rational, other ideas are irrational, but rationality is a critique of idealism to say, well, yeah, there's some idealisms which, yeah, and there's some sorts of idealism which are really valuable. So value creating in the term of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, and of course, here we run aground too with the problem that value and values, that's another one of those key loaded terms that means a completely different thing to moderns than it does to medievals, than it does to ancients and so forth. And this is all juicy terrain. I mean, I really want to get into it, but we're short of time today, so I'm not going to start into it in the last minutes. So he talks here, he talks about the schizophrenia. He means, the clash, but he also is talking about what it does to your brain. If you simultaneously sometimes think of God in a theistic way and sometimes in a deistic way, and they're shifting, you've learned the habit of shifting unconsciously back and forth between them as necessitated by a theology that's actually a fusion of 3 or 4 or maybe 12 different theologies jammed together, and you're supposed to modulate between them as you navigate across these seams, and it does something to your mind because you're not able to maintain a coherent picture of your world. You have to keep hopping from one compartmentalized group of related ideas to a different but adjacent compartmentalized group of ideas that's incompatible with the first one without ever noticing that they're incompatible with each other. And he's saying, the part that I'm calling out is that he's saying ancient critics foresaw these problems, these incoherencies, long before Spinoza did. And I wish, this is one of those things where it's like someone could write a whole book on that. What were the early critiques of Christianity? And by Christianity, I don't mean the early critiques of Jesus, but what were the early critiques of what became the dominant form of Christianity became the orthodoxy. But alas, all we get is this little gesture. So I'll be keeping my eyes out as I do my reading for things like this. But right now, I don't have much more to supply to that other than, ooh, that's intriguing. He wraps up paragraph 8 with, for all of its centuries, Christianity attempted to derive the benefits of radically incommensurable theorizing postures or modes of religious worldviews, right? It's like that issue of you want to have multiple perspectives because a single human perspective has problems. It's the same with theologies. each theology has its strengths and weaknesses, and trying to just cram a bunch of them together and weld them onto each other. On the one hand, it means that you've got a toolbox full of stuff. So you've got more options to play with. But on the other hand, because they're crammed together, pretending to be a single giant everything tool, it's actually really awkward. It's like every time you want to pick up your wrench, it's also welded onto your hammer and your screwdriver and your drill and a bunch of other things, and manipulating it becomes hard. And this is where the incoherency comes from. This is the problem with all the. It's not that monotheism inherently has this defect. It's rather that all the easy, thoughtless approaches to monotheism have this defect. That either you make a real monomania out of it and you exclude everything else, which makes you genocidal, right? You're trying to exterminate the other competing cultures and viewpoints. Or you play a shell game where you actually practice polytheism, but you brand it monotheism. So tell us about all your saints. Tell us about your 3-in-1 God. Tell us about, there's ways in which there's polytheism disguised as monotheism, but because it's disguised, it can't come out and say what it's doing, which means there are certain advantages to polytheism that this kind of crypto polytheism disguised as monotheism can't exploit. And so this is kind of what he's talking about here is, the Orthodox Christianity doesn't want to lose any arguments. Normally, each perspective has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and you say, well, as long as we're in an area of my strengths, I'm going to win. But if we're in an area of my weaknesses, I'm going to lose, and that's just how it is. Whether you're talking about using a screwdriver or whether you're talking about doing karate katas with a staff and only a staff, anytime you're using one selected tool, you have to acknowledge that you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. There's things it's good at and there's things it's not good at. But the Orthodox, they want an empire. They want to rule the world. They don't ever want to lose. They don't want to share space with anybody else. They don't want there to be any other perspectives. That means they have to win everything. And that means they need more than one tool, which is difficult, not impossible, but difficult with monotheism. And so for that reason, they keep welding more things onto their monotheism to give them some of the reach of polytheism. But it creates what I mentioned earlier, the seams, the incompatibilities, the incoherencies. And that becomes the basis for the critiques that are going to mount over the 1,000 some odd years that follow. The other thing is, you can be as incoherent as you want if you're being incoherent by yourself in a little commune in the desert and nobody knows you're there. You're not bugging anybody. Do what you want. But when you bring your incoherencies and attach them to a military empire and a philosophy of genocide that says it's our duty to eliminate all other religions and convert everybody to our religion, now you're making your incoherencies everybody else's problem. This is what I said earlier about why I should never be president. This is what Nietzsche is talking about power makes stupid. It's what Sophocles is talking about in Oedipus, right? When your power magnifies, your vices magnify. The more people you affect, the more people are going to be bothered by your problems. If I talk too much and go on at length, but I'm by myself in the house, who cares? I'm not bothering anybody. But if I try to become president and I insist on putting out a presidential address every single day and it goes on for 3 hours, I become everybody's problem at that point. They're not just little peccadillos of my character at that point. They're writ large upon the world, and it would naturally provoke a pushback from all different quarters of people who have all kinds of different critiques about my vices. This is what happens to the theology and the religious empire of the medieval period. The very goal that it had of being a Catholic religion, a religion that's for everybody, is what caused the pushback to come from every side. You can't try to exterminate all other religions and then be surprised that all other religions not only push back, but that they eventually start critiquing you and where it hurts, because they're looking at you, they see you, you're everywhere for them. They can't avoid you. And with enough people looking, sooner or later, This is the principle of open source software. With enough people looking, sooner or later, someone's going to find the bugs, the real bugs, the bugs that need to be fixed. If you are ecumenical and interfaith and willing to allow other people to have ideas, if you are non-dogmatic and willing to learn from your mistakes, that kind of an exchange can be very helpful. Your software gets better over time as your users give you feedback on it, and you take it into account. You fix the problems. You add the missing features and so forth. But if you're a dogmatist who says, I have the one true software and all other software must be exterminated, everybody has to use my software no matter, and I won't listen to you or change it. You just do what I say. You know, in time, you will generate an army of brilliant critics who have correctly characterized every last thing that's wrong with your software because you've shoved it at them so relentlessly. Their only path forward is through you. So this is the paradox, the contradiction that's built in from the very get-go of the medieval epoch. Its goal provoked its own dissection by generation after generation of very, very smart, observant people.
Well, that was Stavros's plan with the Daleks. If you've ever seen Genesis of the Daleks, the 70s.
I want to.
Yeah, well, the Doctor goes back in time to prevent the creation of the Daleks, and he says to the creator, Davros, do you realise that you're creating one of the most evil beings that will ever exist in the universe? And Davros goes, don't you understand? The Daleks will conquer the entire universe, and then the whole universe will be one, and there will be peace.
Yes. Yes. Or as Hegel says in the philosophy of Geist, we'll know true freedom once there aren't any other religions. Freedom consists of having no choices. Isn't that that's the real freedom, right? Oh, Hegel. So that wraps us up for today with paragraph 8 of chapter 5. I had a great time talking with you all. Ari wasn't here this week. Maybe he can't do Tuesdays or didn't get the announcement, but I agree with Ari. This is the highlight of my week. I love talking with you guys and listening to you and having you getting me think about new things and read new books. And so thank you all. Hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye.
Hi, Rick.